Greetings acolytes and lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. Life creates it, makes it grow. This is the description given to the Force by Master Yoda. He speaks of how the Force connects every living being to the natural world around them. But what if there was a species that removed the barrier of flesh entirely? A species that came directly from and remained connected to the natural world. These were the Neti, a humanoid species of living trees that have witnessed the dawn and dusk of countless civilizations, and yet remain devoted to the Jedi, or at least almost all of them do. Before the holocron opens, our order is approaching 2 million, so if you wish to be endowed with daily Star Wars lore, reach out and crush that subscribe button. Let's begin. It is believed that the Neti species originally evolved from the trees of the Inner Rim world of Myrkr. This isn't surprising to us, as Myrkr regularly finds itself as a hidden gem of Force power. Many of the creatures native to this world manipulate the Force innately. The predatory Vornskr, for example, use it to hunt their prey, and the Ysalamiri created a Force-muting bubble to keep themselves safe. It is no wonder that the trees themselves would be influenced by the potency of this natural world, evolving into a race of sentient beings. For an unknown reason, all of the Neti species would migrate from Myrkr to the mid-rim world of Reich sometime prior to 4000 BBY, and there, their species would remain, rarely venturing out into the surrounding galaxy. As described, Neti were literally living plants. Although they had humanoid forms, their skin was made of bark-like substance, and their hair was often a tangle of foliage or vines. They did not require food, but photosynthesized and drew water for sustenance. Because of their tree-like physiology, they were an extremely long-lived species. In fact, their average lifespan eclipsed that of Yoda's and other long-lived races. At 900 years old, a Neti was only considered a young adult. They lived to be in the thousands, and under certain circumstances, could technically survive indefinitely. The Neti had the ability to change their size at will so long as they had enough nutrients to do so. And one of their most notable abilities was literally to transform back into a tree. This was their hibernation state where they entered a trance that could last millenniums. So long as they had enough water and access to sunlight, their life could extend ceaselessly. Yet, despite their age range, one needn't have to worry about overpopulation. The Neti remained a rare sight in the galaxy, largely due to the fact that they had an extremely infrequent procreation cycle. Reproduction only occurred once every few centuries, and the seeds that resulted often remained dormant for more than 1,000 years before budding and gestating into a new Neti. As a result, their population remained small and close to their homeworld. But that was until it was destroyed. In 4000 BBY, just before Exar Kun's reign as a Dark Lord of the Sith, the planet of Reich was destroyed when a star went supernova. A vast majority of the Neti race was wiped out, save for those that were off-world at the time. The survivors remained on remote locations, though there is knowledge of a small colony that settled on the world of Nerit, one of the moons of Ossus. As we know, this is the only civilization of Neti that remains. The rest spread out and remained solitary, going on their own journeys or joining the Jedi Order. Because of this, their species would fade into obscurity, and eventually into myth. Despite being a very real people, by the time of the Galactic Empire, they were considered mainly folklore. But among the Jedi, they were a very present reality. One of the most famous Jedi of this species was Master Trey Saw, who happened to be one of Mace Windu's Jedi teachers. She lived in the Republic Classic era, and would actually fight in the Clone Wars. She would even develop a relationship with Master Thome, one of Dooku's teachers. She was a valiant warrior and a powerful Force wielder, able to manipulate plants and trees on a mass scale. Few Jedi knew the ability of alter environment like Trey Saw did, as she was capable of forming large barriers out of bark and using vines to tear up enemy ranks. Once Order 66 occurred, Trey Saw fled to Kashyyyk and hid in the forest with Thome and Quinlan Vos. Eventually though, after Thome's death on the planet of Anzat, she would transform into a tree over his funeral pyre and enter a hibernation trance. There, she outlived Order 66, the Empire, the Galactic Civil War, and most of Luke Skywalker's time as Jedi Grand Master. It was only at some point around 40 ABY that Trey Saw awoke and would rejoin the Jedi. Later on, she would find herself as a member of the High Council, and under her leadership, most of Luke's new Jedi Order would survive the Third Great Purge that had been enacted by Darth Krayt deep into the distant future. Despite having a lover at this point, Trey Saw was completely incorruptible. She valued all life dearly, and balked at the notion of assassinating Krayt, Ultimately, she would give her life to protect the Jedi Order when the one Sith attacked their secret Jedi temple. During the battle, she had been aiding everyone with battle meditation, but a crashing starfighter rammed into the building that she was in. The chain reaction created a blast that killed herself and Nat Skywalker. But with her dying thoughts, the two Jedi Masters focused their energy into a massive beam of light. It traveled upwards towards the enemy fleet, creating an opening that allowed the rest of the Jedi to escape. Another notable, and entirely selfless powerful Jedi Master that was a Neti was Master Ud-Banar. Ud-Banar would live a life of over 5,000 years before his eventual demise. He was young during the Great Hyperspace War, and would become a well-renowned scholar with a particular fascination with the dark side. His own master, Odan-Ur, had studied the Sith extensively, and Banar too would take up the subject. However, he remained uncorrupted. His studies into the Sith were exclusively for the purpose of combating them, something that is rare for the Jedi as many of them fall to the dark side unknowingly. But Ud-Banar would use all of his knowledge to instruct new generations of the Jedi Order on how to best combat the dark side and the Sith. By his own admission, he was a poor tactician, but he was able to inform his allies of their enemies' real weaknesses, as well as the best methods to exploit them. Thus, he indirectly helped resolve many crises during the tenure as a Jedi Master. However, his time as a Jedi librarian would come to an end during the Great Sith War. Exar Kun attacked Ossus while also setting in motion the destruction of the Kron Cluster. The cluster of stars went supernova, sending a shockwave radiating through the entire system. As it headed straight for Ossus, Jedi scrambled to save as many scrolls and holocrons as possible. Exar personally slayed Odan-Ur as he plumbed the library for Sith artifacts. Ud-Banar, though, did not evacuate with the others. Instead, he was gathering and hiding a trove of ancient and sacred Jedi lightsabers. There, Exar Kun confronted him, demanding the lightsabers for his own collection. The two briefly dueled, but Banar was quickly bested. Knowing that he could not defeat the Dark Lord, he transformed into a tree and went into his hibernation trance. In the process, he stretched his roots over the trove of lightsabers and deep into the crust of Ossus. It seems that Ud-Banar's force-reinforced bark had an almost indestructible property to it, because Exar Kun didn't even bother trying to retrieve the lightsabers at all now that they were buried. Exar Kun doesn't explain why, but either it would have taken too long, or he couldn't have done it at all. What we do know is that Banar's tree survived the burning shockwave that decimated the entire surface of Ossus, and he would remain there for the next several thousand years. He only reawakened when Luke Skywalker and one of his Jedi were battling Palpatine's dark side elite. With his final act, Banar stretched out his branches and grabbed hold of the stronger of the elite, Cedrus, and pulled him away from a young hostage that he had taken. Cedrus attempted to use the energy of the planet's broken skies to destroy the tree. However, Banar was able to counter this, and drew on the living energy present in his roots deep in the ground of Ossus. In the end, the two annihilated each other in a blast of energy. This was definitely a shame, as it would have been revolutionary for an ancient Jedi Master from the Ossus days to reawaken and to join Luke's new Jedi Order. His knowledge would have been invaluable. However, Luke and his Jedi did gain access to the sacred lightsabers, the lightsabers that the Jedi had valiantly protected for thousands of years. As we examine the Neti Masters, a constant trait of long-lived species is their allegiance to the light side of the Force. This continues to be true for the Neti species as a whole, but there is another layer to their devotion. They are all inherently Force wielders. This definitely makes sense given that they were evolved from the trees of Merkur. We believe, as a result from a concentration of natural Force energy. As living plants, they are directly tied to the soil on which they stand. For humans and other flesh-based species, to say that one is connected to the natural world is often more of a philosophical idea. Even those that can touch the Force, it is something that they have to practice and get in touch with. But the Neti draw their very life essence from nature. They are nature, so they are far more sensitive to the positive and negative shifts and changes in the natural world. It's almost as if they feel it first through their own body and second in the Force. For this reason, we imagine that the dark side would be intolerable to such creatures, since its focus is on destruction and pain rather than newness and life. We went into research for this video with the expectation that all Neti Masters were exclusively Jedi, and because of their history, they and the Sith had a distinct hatred for one another. But we have discovered that this was not the case. In a shocking new discovery, we found that there was indeed one singular Neti Sith Lord. His name was Dale Liss, and he was likely a dark mirror to Ood Banar. He lived prior to 3645 BBY and was a part of Darth Vitiate's empire. He was the chief librarian of the Odacer Foston Academy, taking over after the death of Darth Dreer. He can be found in the rather obscure novel known as Red Harvest, which tells us the story of Darth Scabrous, a Sith Lord who attempts to create an elixir for immortality. Unfortunately though, it all goes horrifically wrong and unleashes a virus upon the Sith Academy that transforms the infected into flesh-eating undead. During the outbreak, Dale Liss was able to protect himself early, barricading himself inside of the library. Darth Scabrous had gained the research from his experiment from the holocron of Darth Dreer, and because Dale Liss had studied it, he was the one who knew of Scabrous' experiments. He was the Sith Master who survived the longest during the apocalyptic outbreak. However, Darth Scabrous himself managed to break in and infected him. However, instead of transforming him into the undead, the sickness had a very different effect on the Neti. As he began to succumb, Dale Liss went mad and began frantically burning all of the library's scrolls and holobooks. The flames would eventually consume him as well, ending the only Neti Sith Lord in the lore. Outside of this small part in this one story though, there isn't much else to know about the Neti Sith, or why he would betray the ideals of his very species in order to follow and embrace the dark side. But our theory is, we would have to look at the timeline for our answer. This was 4000 BBY. The Neti homeworld of Reich was destroyed in a supernova, and I would like to imagine that this Neti was there to see it happen, to feel his people die in the Force. Then, only a mere few years later, he would also bear witness to the destruction of Ossus by the same means. His conclusion was this: the natural world that he spent so long being connected to had betrayed him. The sun, from which he and his people drew nourishment and life, turned on them and slew them. Then it did the same to the Jedi, and they were powerless to stop it. In his grief, he would decide that only the burning flame of the dark side would provide the nourishment that he needed. If the natural world was so quick to betray him, then he would betray it first. May the laws of nature be damned. He will become their corruption and their destruction. And this is why Dale Liss had studied the holocron of Darth Dreer and would have known about the horrible, twisted experiments of Darth Scabrous. I feel that if something like this were explored in more detail, it would make for an extremely compelling character. It already provides an amazing juxtaposition to the entirely selfless Jedi of his species. But of course, what do you think? Would you want to see more explorations into the Neti species? Or perhaps a story involving a much younger Neti Jedi? I think that it would be really fun to have a story of a young Yoda and a young Neti go through Jedi training together. It could serve as an interesting exploration on the perspective of long-lived species living in a world of those that grow old far too quickly. It would be a unique challenge to their devotion to the Jedi, and show how they are forced to let go of those that they fear to lose. Just like Yoda would later tell Anakin, they must rejoice for those who transform into the Force. Do not mourn them, do not miss them. Because what Yoda likely does not tell Anakin is that doing that will drive you insane. Perhaps Yoda watched his Neti friend go insane over grief, become unable to cope with losing their shorter-lived friends so quickly. If that's a story that you would like to see explored later, let us know, and how do you think that would all play out? But in Star Wars lore, one of the strangest aspects about galactic society is their fear and reverence for the species known as the Hutts. Upon taking a look at one of them, one sees nothing redeemable or respectable about them whatsoever. By and large, they are greedy, utterly depraved, murderous thieves of a disgusting species that sometimes gets so lazy that they become incapable of moving on their own. And yet, they are often the second or the third most powerful entities in the whole galaxy. They are altogether reviled and feared by everyone, all due to the overbearing reach of their criminal enterprise. Their empire spans an entire quarter of the known galaxy, and they get to basically do what they want without the Republic or the Jedi interfering out of concern for reprisal. So how did the Hutts get like this? How did a slovenly species like the Hutts become so powerful that every entity in the galaxy trembled in fear of them? Greetings, Acolytes, and welcome to the Archives. In today's holocron, we are going to journey back to the earliest days of history in order to document how the Hutts rose to prominence. how they became the most feared species in the entire galaxy, and how their empire managed to endure the rise and fall of both the Republic and the Galactic Empire. Our story begins as far back before the formation of the Republic, in the days of the Rakata, when the Infinite Empire ruled the stars. The original homeworld of the Hutts was a lush forest world known as Varl. The planet has become something legendary and mythological since its origins, but it is known that it was a real place, as it can still be found in the Ardo system in the Mid-Rim today, but it is not like it once was. But long ago, Varl became a part of the Infinite Empire. Scholars believe that originally the Hutts were likely solitary beings that grouped together during a crisis point, when their population was too great and resources too few. This led their species being threatened with extinction. However, no true records exist, and thus, much of the early development of the Hutt civilization remains a mystery. But what is known is that the ancient Hutts were a warrior race, known for their powerful physique and ability to outmatch any creature that attempted to step up to them. When legions of these Hutt warriors grouped together to attack, none could oppose them, both because of their incredible strength and their pitiless guile. The Hutts totally dominated the world of Varl. When the Infinite Empire began to collapse and grow weak, a Hutt by the name of Ardistag the Absolute would lead a series of mass uprisings against the Rakata, freeing Varl from their rule. The Hutts might have been the first of the species to throw off the oppressive yoke of the Empire, displaying the power of the ancient Hutts. In the aftermath, the Hutts seized the leftover Rakatan technology for themselves, using it to forge their own empire. Once again, early history is left largely unknown, as early historical records in the galaxy conflict with one another as to how the Hutts achieved interstellar travel. It is not known whether they developed it themselves, or the more likely option, they stole it from another spacefaring species, maybe the Rakata. The Hutts usually like to paint themselves in a grandiose light, so a lot of what has been written has been doctored by them. What is known is that the Hutts were an aggressive species with expansionist plans who invaded several outlying worlds. They got the jump on this hundreds of years before the core worlds formed, and the Republic formed in the year 25,053 BBY, making them the largest early galactic civilization and superpower. The Essential Guide to Warfare gives us a very detailed look at this expansionist period of the Hutt Empire. They sought their destiny among the stars, away from Varl. Whenever they encountered a species strong enough to resist them, that species would be utterly destroyed. When they encountered a species too weak to be of use to them, it would meet the same fate. Only the species that were purely useful to the Hutt ambitions, but able to be mastered, were allowed to survive. And even many of them worked to near extinction. The Hutts have always utilized a grab bag of technologies that were copied, borrowed, or outright stolen from others. Because of this, little is known about their own native technologies, assuming they ever even had any. Perhaps the best glimpse of the ancient Hutts comes from the records that were kept by the Sacaeans, one of the few species in Hutt space to maintain their independence, and to win the respect of the Hutts. The Sacaean chronicles tell of Hutt warriors clad in iron shells, moving via clattering metal limbs, treads, or wheels. They essentially made up for their lack of mobility by using technology to turn them into living tanks. They were robust enough to take multiple strong hits, and very naturally strong. It is even said that the mucus produced from the Hutt's skin makes them extra difficult to kill with blades. The ancient Sacaeans helped the Hutts construct weapons known as the plain Changas, which were massive railguns that acted as ballistas, accelerating space debris and asteroids to planet-cracking velocities. Many records speak of the horrors that the ancient Hutts wrought upon their section of space, with accounts recording worlds who somehow offended the Hutts being depopulated, poisoned, bombarded, or even incinerated. But what propelled the Hutts to their fame was their war with Zim the Despot. Their empire was eventually challenged in the year 25,102 BBY by the human Tianese warrior named Zim, who had formed a powerful interstellar empire of his own within the Tion cluster. History remembers Zim in many ways, but all of them were a picture of strength, might, and genius. We might equate Zim the Despot to our world's Alexander the Great, and in the ancient galaxy, this was the name that echoed the word power throughout the stars. Adventurous Tianese scouts and merchants explored beyond the Tian cluster, hoping to win Zim's favor by discovering rich new worlds. But then, some returned describing meetings with alien traders, those who served ruthless slug-like creatures. From this point forward, the Hutts became Zim's obsession. He burned with the desire to add the Hutt trade worlds to his empire, and to grow his wealth all the more. In the 25th year of the reign of Zim, he assaulted the Hutt worlds and sacked Kovari, but the Hutts would not be so easily defeated. The current lord of the Hutts, Kosak, was a crafty foe. He lured Zim into ritual combat on the world of Vontor. The despot would fight 3 battles there, all of which he would lose. At the first, which took place in 25,100 BBY, his starships were bested in space. At the rematch, his ground forces were defeated by the heavy infantry units of the Hutts, those that they had enlisted from their own conquered worlds. Zim was then given the choice for the third battle to be fought on either ground or space. He chose ground, and at the third battle of Vontor, he and his soldiers, as well as war droids, were overwhelmed by something called the Nikto, Vodran, and Clotunian berserkers led by Bunta the Hutt. But so obsessed was Zim with Hutt space that he ignored his advisors and bled his entire empire dry, creating warships and battle droids. Vontor simply showed the depth of his foolishness, as he had been lured into fighting a war from his own borders, and therefore far from his supply lines. Zim was not just defeated, but captured and paraded around in chains throughout all of Hutt space. And just like that, the Hutts became renowned for their guile and terrifying approach to war. They were extremely intelligent and had just taken down one of the most feared men in galactic history. The next major event that would launch them into the next phase of their empire was the Hutt cataclysms of 15,000 BBY. The origin of the cataclysms are unknown to the rest of the galaxy. Some claims said that Varro befell some great natural calamity in the past that left the world a barren wasteland, but the Hutts themselves have a different way of telling it. According to their legends, the planet of Varro orbited 2 suns, Evona and Ardos. Evona and Ardos were venerated as gods by the Hutts. Evona was consumed by a black hole, and in fury, Ardos expelled its gaseous external layers, destroying the other planets of the star system in 15,000 BBY. Somehow though, the world of Varro survived. Though its atmosphere was vaporized, its biosphere was annihilated, and it was left a wasteland. But the majority of the scientific minds of the galaxy subscribed to a different theory and belief, that Varro was destroyed by the Hutts themselves, embroiled in a civil war of such vicious ferocity that only their own kind were capable of comprehending its true horrors. But whether through natural disaster, nuclear holocaust, or the wrath of a sun god, Varro was uninhabitable, and the Hutts resettled on the planet of Evokar, which they would rename Nalhutta, meaning glorious jewel in Huttese. The survival of the destruction of their original system led the Hutts' belief that they had surpassed the divinity of their pantheon, and were now greater than the ones that they had once worshipped as gods. Having decided that Evokar was their suitable home, they traded their modern technology with the native Evochi in exchange for pieces of land of Evokar. During this time, the Evochi did not realize that the Hutts' purchase of real estate was essentially buying the planet from them. By the time they got wise to the Hutt schemes, it was too little too late. The construction teams had arrived to tear down the native lodges and monuments, replacing them with Hutt structures. What followed was the creation of tacky bathhouses, pleasure palaces, pavilions, and Hutt shrines. The temperate rainforests were bulldozed and replaced with stagnant swampland whose foul, putrid odors appealed only to the Hutt senses. Similar construction efforts conducted on the planet's moon, Nar Shaddaa. Due to its growing importance in smuggling circles, it was thus paved over to allow for countless cargo warehouses, docking towers, trading plazas, and landing bays. They transformed the lush moon into an ecumenopolis much like Terrace or Coruscant, but on a smaller, grosser scale. In the aftermath of the usurpation, the Evochi attempted to appeal to the Galactic Republic, but neither they nor the Jedi found a loophole in the Hutt contract. The species had converted their cunning war strategies and applied them to business. once again making them extremely deadly and feared. As a result, the Avoci were displaced to the moon of Nar Shaddaa that was deeded to them. However, unknown to them, the Hutt's business representatives had bribed the negotiators that forced the species to remain as cheap in-system labor. In time, the Hutts confiscated more land and bought more of the growing industry, which saw more Avoci exploited. It got so bad that they became the degenerate subclass in the lowest levels of the city moon. On their new homeworld, the Hutt Grand Council was established by Hodhila Histilik Amura, who then also created the philosophy of the Khajidik, the word meaning somebody got to have it, why not us? Khajidik also became the term that many Hutts used to refer to their clans, their business enterprises, and their criminal syndicates. The Khajidiks were governed by the Hutt Grand Council, which oversaw their operations, and each Khajidik had an appointed leader, known as the Khajidi, or the Lorda. The teachings of this new philosophy would completely refocus Hutt life. It taught that fierce competition among the clans removed the weak from their ranks. Yet it also warned against outright warfare or territorial conquest. Turning away from their warlike past, they believed that since they were now gods in their own eyes, normal means of conflict were tools used by weaker species. This era saw their earlier histories transformed into myth. The Hutts would now pursue a policy of manipulation, of working in the shadows, rather than their previous warring ways. Yet they allowed their syndicates be operated in the open, claiming ownership over dozens of worlds. Through smuggling lucrative goods and drugs, selling weapons, black market trade, predatory business practices, cunning deals and contracts, as well as exploitation, the warlike Hutts made a very different kind of conquest, one of commerce and criminal enterprise. By the time the Republic became the dominant superpower in the galaxy, the Hutt Empire had existed for centuries and took up a vast portion of known space. To try to impose the rule of law on the Hutts was to invite war with the Republic, a war they could not afford. The Hutts controlled enough mercenaries and thugs to rapidly build a powerful army if need be, likely repeating it with the Navy as well. Not to mention, they had their hands in so many Republic businesses that they could cripple the market if they even desired to. However, the Hutts themselves did not want war with the Republic either, stating that it was bad for business. So they kept a cordiality with their neighbors, paid them taxes, and left well enough alone. Since they chose not to cause trouble, the Republic willingly turned a blind eye to the Hutts' criminal activity, to the point of overlooking even slave trade occurring in the outer rim of the Republic. So to answer the question simply, why were the Hutts the most feared and powerful species in the galaxy? Well, it's because they were the first. They were the ultimate galactic equivalent of old money. They had formed their empire before the Republic ever began. By the time people started questioning why these lazy, depraved gangsters were in charge, it was far too late. Their connections ran too deep, and they were fabulously wealthy. The galaxy's elite catered to their whims, and even the Jedi, the guardians of peace and justice among the stars, avoided trifling with them as much as possible. Although many Hutts allowed their physicality to slip, their minds were as strong and dubious as ever. Many of them were immune completely to forced persuasion, and threatening them with weapons rarely produced results. Even when the Republic fell and the Galactic Empire was instated, the Hutts' way of life barely changed. All they had to do was acknowledge the Empire's superiority and pay them taxes. As a result, the Empire didn't really meddle in their affairs either, unless smugglers entered Imperial space. I do hope that this answered some of your burning questions about the Hutts as a species, and how they managed to keep a vice grip of power on the galaxy. They aren't very impressive when one first looks at them, but digging beneath the layers of filth is the only way to expose just how strong they really are. Even the Sith don't want to tangle with them unless it's absolutely necessary, and more often than not, they try to use them as an asset instead. But luckily for the Hutts, the area of space they controlled had very little value to the Sith, so it wasn't like the two of them ran aground very often. As always though, we want to hear your thoughts on the subject. Had you been wanting to know a little bit more about the Hutts? If you like these type of videos exploring some of the societal structures of the galaxy, be sure to let us know in the comments below, and Yoda's species is one of the greatest mysteries in all of Star Wars lore. George Lucas created Yoda to embody the enigma of the Force. He spoke strangely, contained great powers, and had no history beyond what affiliated him with the Jedi. And ever since his creation, Lucas has forbidden any exploration into much of Yoda's past and his species as a whole. This leaves us with many pieces but no complete picture on who and what Yoda's species is. Since then, several more members of his species have popped up here and there throughout the Star Wars timeline, and we can't help but wonder what the lives of each one says about their species as a whole. This leaves us with many pieces but no complete picture. Could we gain more insight into the truth by analyzing each of them? Greetings lore junkies and acolytes, and come along with us today as we attempt to examine one of the greatest mysteries of the entire galaxy, Yoda's species. Before we get into each individual member of Yoda's species, we wanted to first discuss what little we know about them. Yoda himself is quite guarded about his people and especially his home planet. He's never divulged where they come from, and neither has any other members of his species who's ever been a part of the Jedi. It seems to be a collective decision that their race has to remain a total secret to everyone, even the Jedi Order. Having said that though, their species seems intrinsically tied to the Jedi as well. Each member that we know of has been trained as one, and they all seem to be exclusively devoted to the light side and the Jedi way. Except one, of course, and that is Grogu, who is too young and too emotionally connected to Din Djarin. Because of this, we have a theory that we want to discuss. Some species exist in the galaxy with a born affinity to one side of the Force or the other. The Dathomirians lean more towards the dark, whereas beings like the Ithorians or the Kaldor lean more towards the light. But long ago, the Sith purebloods of Korriban were all born with a natural proclivity to the dark side. In some ways, one may even say that they were the chosen representatives of the dark side of the time. We have toyed with the idea before that Yoda's species could be the same thing, but for the light. The two species share many things in common actually. They are both exceptionally long-lived. Every member of their species is naturally Force sensitive, at least as we're aware, and from the very fibers of their being, they exude a predisposition to one side of the Force. But just as the Sith are the champions of the dark side, Yoda's species could be the prophets of the light. This is why we believe that they all have an immediate connection to the Jedi, but because they all know the dangers of what being a Jedi brings, they keep the location of their people a secret. Possibly also because their people are primitive, a peace-loving species that desires to remain hidden from the wider conflicts of the galaxy. If I had to guess, I believe that their planet either lies somewhere in the unknown regions, or in an undiscovered world in the deep core. This would explain why so few of them are in the galaxy, as hyperspace anomalies cause travel to and from the unknown regions and deep core to be very treacherous. But moving on, the amount of theories regarding Yoda's species is absolutely staggering. We would be here all day long if we tried to discuss each and every one of them. The name of Yoda's species is also hotly debated. Once again, Yoda is silent on the matter on even what he's called. Out of universe, this was because George Lucas wanted to keep an air of mystery around him. But also, Lucas once had the idea that Yoda was an entirely unique being, possibly the only one of his kind. In universe, many have mistaken exactly what Yoda is. An example of this is a Republic file even misidentified him as a Lanik, which is the race of Master Evan Piel. Many beings have chosen to refer to Yoda's species as a tridactyl because of their 3 fingers and their 3 toes. This is of course an entirely unofficial name though. However, for the purposes of this video, we're going to adopt that name if not for any other reason than not to be constantly repeating Yoda's species again and again. So, the tridactyls it is. The tridactyls appear to be of amphibian descent, and show an affinity for trees and swampier environments. Grogu shows that they may actually be carnivorous to begin with. He himself likes eating raw eggs and small creatures whole. It's possible that tridactyls train themselves to be omnivorous in order to exist in the wider galaxy though. However, their taste is very odd. Yoda, most notably, ate very strange dishes in the Jedi Temple's mess hall. He would eat bowls of some sort of sustenance that no one could quite figure out what exactly it was. At one point, a Temple service droid attempted to take Yoda's meal away from him because he could not identify it as food. On Dagobah, Yoda returned to his more carnivorous roots though, hunting other creatures. However, he refused to use his lightsaber to do so, believing that it was undignified for such a Jedi weapon. Soon enough though, his age kept him from being able to hunt at all, so he took to foraging for fungus and roots, usually making his root leaf stew as his staple meal. As far as their society and their culture goes, we basically have nothing to go off of. Strangely, there are no records or stories of Yoda and Yaddle interacting in any other setting besides in High Council meetings, unless they spoke privately. Then it almost seems as though they expressly avoided one-on-one conversations with each other. In fact, it seems they hardly know one another at all, as when either of them speak of the other, they do so very impersonally. In Yaddle's comic, The One Below, Yoda even opposes her rejoining the Jedi Order, or even being admitted to the High Council. And once a student by the name of Sipa Tarko asked Yaddle if Yoda was her brother, and she simply responded with this: "Hush, child, he is not. He is Master Yoda, a great teacher." What we can infer from this is that Yoda's species do not show favor to one another simply because they are of the same flesh. They judge based on merit alone and identify only as Jedi, not as beings of the same species. This falls deeply in line with Yoda's character actually, as he has a connection to the Jedi Order. In the novel Yoda Dark Rendezvous and in Clone Wars Season 6, it is shown that Yoda sees the whole Jedi as his family and as his children. He can see all beings around him through the Force, not as their physical race. This was the instruction that he gave to Luke when he said this: "Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter." So perhaps this is a racial trait that tridactyls are so in tune with the Force that they only see through its lens. But the only image we've ever seen that reveals Yoda's society is a trading card that Lucasfilm has suppressed. The Star Wars Galaxy's trading cards almost released one that had art of several members of Yoda's species gathered around an idol which depicted their race. A monk or a priest was in the center holding a staff and levitating with the Force. The other 6 members present have their hands outstretched in worship, or are holding burning incense plates. This trading card was never released, as it showed too much of Yoda's species that was never meant to be seen. It's currently unknown whether this can be considered canon, or Legends continuity, or no continuity at all. And finally, there is the matter of their speech. Yoda speaks in a strange dialect where he will sometimes place the predicate before the subject. This speech quirk was originally identified as a trait that all members of his species shared. In early Legends content, Yaddle speaks the same way, as does the Jedi Knight by the name of Minch. However, neither of the 2 earliest members of their species, Vandar Tokare and Oteg, spoke this way. They spoke in regular Basic, without changing their sentence structure at all. And in canon, Yaddle also speaks plain Basic. Grogu has yet to audibly speak at all, so we don't know if this speech quirk is innate or learned. There are many theories as to why Yoda speaks this way though. Popularly, and most believe, that this is the dialect of the tridactyl language and how it translates directly to Basic. But none of the other members seem to have an issue with this. And since Yoda is almost 900 years old, he shouldn't either. We, though, have a theory that his dialect reflects his views on the Force. With the action portion of his sentence being said first, the verb is given priority over the subject. This could indicate that Yoda is trying to emphasize action and doing. His mantra is do or do not, there is no try. So placing the action of his sentence first, it immediately establishes in the mind of his students what needs to be done, or is being done. So this could be a teaching method uniquely developed by Yoda and adopted by others. But anyway, linguistic tangent aside, let's actually begin talking about all of the members of Yoda's species and what we know concrete. The first tridactyl appears in the timeline as Master Vandar Tokare, who was a part of the High Council during the era of Revan. Vandar immediately separates himself from the other members of the species as the only one to express a surname. He also has more olive-toned skin instead of the typical green. Master Vandar's exact age is unknown, but we do know that he was brought up in the Order when the Jedi was still located on the world of Ossus. This means that he would have remembered the Great Library, studied there, and watched it fall under Exar Kun. He likely also participated in the Great Sith War. The earliest records of his actions were 4225 BBY, where he was already a Jedi Master who had 2 apprentices. The 3 took on a mission to the world of Caecilius, where they led Republic troopers in a campaign to retake the system from criminal overlords. The event was known as the Caecili Reconquista, and in it, Vandar led attacks on the most criminally infested cities and managed to detangle their syndicates. Within 3 months, the world was purified and once again safe to inhabit. At some point after this, he ascended to a seat on the Jedi High Council and was made at the head of the Dantooine Enclave. This was apparently how he survived the destruction of Ossus at the hands of Exar. His enclave became a new home base for the Jedi following their home planet's decimation. And there, Vandar would rebuild the High Council. However, in this time, there did not seem to be a Grand Master. Instead, the council was led by 3 senior members, Vandar himself, his friend Rook Lamar, and Jedi Dorak. Vandar and Lamar were known to frequently argue, as Rook Lamar was very critical and skeptical, whereas Vandar was much more understanding and willing to listen. Tok'er was in fact the most agreeable member of the High Council. He gave careful thought to all situations and was wise in his approaches. His willingness to hear people out was instrumental to the success of several situations. When the Jedi Lucian Dre and the Masters of the Covenant all killed their Padawans, they blamed it squarely on the Jedi Padawan Zane Carrick, who had managed to escape. Zane had actually been Vandar Tok'er's student before he went to train with Lucian, and although Vandar at first believed that he was guilty, he had a sense that something was deeply wrong. Lucian Dre manipulated his way to a seat on the High Council as well, and Vandar allowed it to happen only so that he could keep a closer eye on him. Meanwhile, he went around uncovering the truth about how much influence Lucian actually had, not just within their sector of space, but within the Jedi Order. And Vandar was the first to accept that Zane was innocent, and work to have his name completely cleared. But what he is often remembered for in history was his remarkable power in foresight. Though the future is always in motion, Tok'er excelled at reading the flow of time with near certainty. Soon the council came to rely on his future sight for many of their decision makings, which ended up becoming an ultimate detriment to them. Vandar had a premonition that destruction would befall the galaxy in the coming Jedi Civil War. Sadly, the warnings that he gave his fellow masters were misinterpreted. The council believed that he was warning them against engaging with the Mandalorians, who were the present threat in the galaxy. Their actions actually caused Revan to be galvanized against Mandalore the Ultimate, which led to his and Malik's fall and embrace of the dark side. The 2 Jedi waged the Jedi Civil War until Darth Revan was captured by Bastila Shan once he was betrayed by Malik. Bastila would bring Revan before the council, and they all combined their powers to completely wipe his memory in an effort to return him to the light forcefully. Vandar would advocate for the amnesiac Revan to be reintegrated into the Jedi. He was also the first of the council to sense that Revan and Bastila had a connection, one that would ultimately save the galaxy. Following this, he narrowly escaped Darth Malik's orbital bombardment of Dantooine, and he went on to fight in the Battle of Rakata Prime, where he directed the Republic naval forces. But after Darth Malik was defeated, things would go downhill. 50 years of betrayals, defections, and death had dwindled both the numbers and the spirits of the Jedi. The Sith returned from the shadows, forming the Sith triumvirate consisting of Nihilus, Sion, and Traya. Their divide and conquer tactic sees them striking the Jedi from the shadows, bringing them towards complete annihilation. Master Atris in this time, in an effort to locate and draw their attackers out of hiding, summoned all of the Jedi to the planet of Qatar under the guise of a secret meeting. Master Vandar Tok'er was among these Jedi, and just like the rest, he was completely helpless when Darth Nihilus arrived and consumed all life on the surface of the world. Perhaps Tok'er's premonitions failed him, or perhaps his instincts led him to becoming one with the Force. But perhaps if he had been able to fight, he wouldn't have gone down so easily at all. Though largely known for his wisdom, Tok'er was a terrifying fighter. He dual-wielded Shoto lightsabers, and like many others of his species, preferred Ataru as his chosen lightsaber form. However, his mastery of the Force enabled him to wield both of his lightsabers telekinetically, a feat that very few have managed to achieve in lore. But the true awe-striking power comes from Tok'er's repertoire of esoteric and strange powers. Vandar was skilled with Force healing and Tutaminis, but he could also affect his opponents in very strange ways. He could slow someone down as if they were moving through water. He could suppress or even outright sever another being's connection to the Force. And he could even amplify potency of his own abilities to be more devastating at close range, or affect others at long distances. Vandar Tok'er was no joke, and he set the standard for what we come to expect from Yoda's species moving forward in the timeline. The next Tridactyl we know of is much less impressive than Vandar, only because we never see nor hear of any of his battlefield feats. His name was Oteg, and he joined the Jedi Order 100 years after Vandar's death. His most prominent time, though, was the role that he served in the Great Galactic War and the cold year of 3653 BBY. Oteg served aboard the starship known as the Seraphim Wanderer, assuming the role of captain after a heroic act of leadership. This happened when the resurgent Sith Empire attacked his fleet and killed the ship's captain. Oteg quickly assumed command and drove the Imperial fleet into a nearby nebula. He then tricked them into detonating the volatile space gases of the nebula, successfully destroying their fleet with only one ship and his own wit. Following the Treaty of Coruscant and Malgus sacking the Jedi Temple, this started the Cold War, and Oteg was elected to be a member of the High Council. As the years went on, the unsustainable peace treaty began to slowly fracture. Oteg was given the position of Fleet Admiral by the Supreme Chancellor, and at some point following this, Oteg would be contacted by the Force Ghost of the Jedi Mitra Surik. Mitra informed him of a powerful prisoner being held by the Sith Empire. Oteg in response would summon a 4-man strike team and directed an operation to liberate the Jedi Master, who was later revealed to be Revan, who had been held captive by the Sith Emperor for nearly 300 years. Once they obtained the means by which to free Revan, Oteg led the Republic fleet into an engagement with the Sith Imperial fleet that was protecting the prison. He used his ingenuity yet again to keep the Imperial fleet occupied, while simultaneously directing the team through the prison's facility. Once they freed Revan, Oteg welcomed him aboard the flagship called the Telos, and for a while, Oteg would house the reborn Revan as he slowly regained his bearings back from being imprisoned for 3 centuries. We don't really hear anything about Oteg after this, unfortunately, so we can only assume that he went on to bravely fight against the Sith just like every other Jedi of the era. Besides his mission to rescue Revan, he's one of the more unremarkable members of Yoda's species, but he's still worth mentioning since his kind is so extremely rare. The next entry is a member of Yoda's species that we've never seen anyone talk about before. This is potentially the 7th member of the Tridactyl race ever known to the galaxy, and he goes by nearly entirely unnoticed. This is because we have no documentation of him at all. He has no name, he has no combat stories, and no mention from the era of which he's a part of. All we have of him is a giant carved statue which lies in the Valley of the Jedi on Ruusan. The Valley of the Jedi is our only clue, and is a very important historical location though. In the year 1000 BBY, Darth Bane manipulated the Brotherhood of Darkness into conducting the Thought Bomb ritual. He had created the weapon so as to deceive his fellow Sith into believing that it would wipe out all of the Jedi, but in reality, it would consume them as well, destroying the Sith Order so that it could be remade into the Rule of Two. General Hoth led 99 Jedi into the caves of Ruusan to stop this ritual, but when they encountered the Sith, Lord Khan detonated the thought bomb early. The explosion vaporized all who were present and totally devastated Ruusan's environment. The souls and essence of all of the Jedi and Sith present there were drawn into a floating iridescent orb, where all of their souls remained trapped for centuries. This area became a powerful Force nexus and was named the Valley of the Jedi. A young Jedi by the name of Johann Othone, who was one of Hoth's former Padawans, went against the will of the High Council to build monuments to the heroes of the Light and Darkness War. There in the valley, he erected large statues that had busts of the Jedi who had sacrificed themselves, and among the very largest of these was the clearly depicted head of Yoda's species. This is notable because by this point, Oteg had been dead for several millennia, long enough to where it would make little sense for him to be honored here, and this was well over 100 years prior to the birth of Yoda himself. So the only reason for there to be a prominent head of their species carved here was if a Tridactyl Jedi was a part of Hoth's army of light, and one of those that sacrificed their lives there to stop the Thought Bomb ritual. The next member of Yoda's species to mention is the Jedi Knight by the name of Minch. Our first and only story about Minch comes from the comic called Heart of Darkness, in Star Wars Tales number 16. This takes place in the year 700 BBY. Minch was apprenticed to a Zabrak Jedi Master by the name of Tidai, and the two were dispatched as a part of a Jedi strike team to hunt down the Dark Jedi of Bafash. A Dark Jedi Master and several of his apprentices had been cutting a swath of destruction through the slowest sector, but the strike team managed to track them to the Commerce Guild trading station. Within the corridors of the station, several of the Dark Jedi fell, and Minch cornered the last apprentice in a dark hallway. The two engaged in a fierce duel, one that Minch actually loses. Luckily for him though, his master and Jedi compatriots arrived to his aid. the Dark Apprentice, now outnumbered, proclaimed that the end of the Jedi Order was nigh, and upon saying this, he uses his lightsaber to commit a seppuku, dying on the spot. Just then, Jedi intelligence detected a ship having launched from one of the station's docking bays. Undoubtedly, this was the Dark Jedi Master making a break for it. The Jedi chased him down to the world of Dagobah using their starships. However, they hesitated to land, fearing it would be too dangerous to attempt a landing in a small starfighter. Minch, however, was displeased by the loss to the Dark Apprentice. Disobeying his master's direct order, the young Tridactyl races down to Dagobah alone. In a scene that would be mirrored by Luke crashing later, Minch also finds his ship buried deep in the swamp. Once again disobeying his master's orders to stay put, he chases the Dark Jedi through the swamp, ending up in an overgrown dark cave. The young Tridactyl challenges the master, but the Dark Jedi uses his powers in the dark side to conjure terrifying illusions that overwhelm the young Jedi. The entire time, the Dark Jedi taunts him about his anger, his impatience, and teases him about his small size. Giving to panic, Minch rapidly slashes with his lightsaber, and actually manages a lethal blow on the Dark Jedi Master. As he lays dying, the Dark Jedi declares that Minch's mind is weak, that it is open to anger, and that one day he will make a fine addition to the dark side. The Bafashi breathes his last, and when this happens, his wicked essence forever taints the dark cave, turning it into a dark side nexus. The same nexus that Yoda would later use to cloud his own presence in the Force from the watching eyes of Sidious and Vader. Although he won the battle, young Minch knew that he had been defeated in the spirit. His anger and impatience had conquered him, and he slew another being out of emotion. Minch walked away from the Cave of Evil with his head hung low, ready to be extracted by the Jedi Strike Team. This is unfortunately the very last time we ever hear a mention of Minch. And if we had to take a guess, the young knight feared the words of the Bafashi Jedi and worried about embracing the dark side one day, so we believe that he may have abandoned the Jedi out of penance before this could ever happen. Again, this isn't confirmed, it's only our theory. Given that Yoda himself was born in the year 896 BBY, the two actually would have known one another. Because of several coincidences, we were once convinced that Minch and Yoda may be the same person. However, our theory was absolutely blown out of the water because Yoda achieved the rank of Jedi Master at the age of 96 in the year 800 BBY. This was exactly 100 years before the story of Minch, who is expressly stated as a Jedi Knight. Also, his speech pattern is the same as Yoda's, so since no Tridactyl before Yoda spoke with this unique dialect, this lends credence to our theory that they voluntarily adopted his manner of speaking, modeling it after the way Yoda himself spoke. But in his lifetime, Yoda knew another one of his species, Yaddle, so far the only female of their kind that we have ever met. Yaddle achieved a full lifespan of 483 years old in Legends, and 477 in canon. Her origins are told to us in the comic titled Yaddle's Tale, the one below, in Star Wars Tales number 5. Around 300 BBY, Yaddle would be apprenticed to a Jedi by the name of Polvin Kut. She and he were summoned to liberate the planet of Koba from a warlord by the name of Tulak. Her master had tried to organize a resistance, but was betrayed from the inside, leaving him and Yaddle to face the warlord's forces completely alone. What Yaddle only found out years later was that Tulak had killed Polvin's family a long time ago, and her Jedi Master harbored a deep-seated rage against the warlord. As the ambush commenced, Yaddle watched as her Jedi Master gave in to his dark emotions, charging head first, and ultimately dying in the battle, unable to let go of his pain. Yaddle was captured by Tulak and tortured for years in imprisonment, hoping to lure other Jedi to the planet, yet all attempts to break her out had failed. Tulak had Yaddle thrown into a pit where she was sealed away permanently. He did not execute her just in case she proved to be a useful hostage in the future. But eventually, he forgot all about her. During her centuries of isolation, Yaddle would relive what little lessons she had from her Jedi Master. She spent that entire time meditating on the Force, and soon went on an internal journey. Yaddle ultimately came to forgive her captors, and even Tulak, achieving unity with the Force. But soon the planet above all but forgot about her. Tulak had plundered the world of Koba so entirely that they barely had any food, and soon reverted back to a state of primitivism. Tales continue, however, about the one below, and a few superstitious villagers would occasionally lower provisions down into Yaddle's pit as a sort of sacrament. this would be her only source of nourishment beyond harnessing the living force. While down below, Yaddle taught herself the art of combat, defending herself against predators and large beasts. Using only a wooden staff and the force as her weapon, she became adept at combat out of survival necessity. Many decades would pass, and soon, tectonic shifts caused devastating earthquakes to the world. At long last, the pit opened and Yaddle was finally free. However, upon reaching the surface, she saw that the natives' entire way of life had come crashing down around them. What the years of famine and plague had not destroyed, the earthquakes had. Having compassion for the Kobans though, Yaddle willingly remained behind, using her powers to heal the people and to rebuild their society. Eventually, Evan PL discovered her existence and invited her back to Coruscant to finish her training as a Jedi. However, Yaddle declined, as she still wanted to lift up the Koban people. Eventually, Tulak's son would return to the world in order to claim his inheritance. The only one to defend the people was Yaddle herself. She entered a brief but a vicious duel with the warlord, kicking his own dagger into his neck. Yaddle had finished what her master had started, but did so without anger or aggression. Soon enough, Yaddle would return to the Jedi, and in the year 44 BBY, she was summoned to the High Council by Evan PL. Evan advocated for her in front of the entire council, believing that she should be given the rank of Jedi Master. It was Yoda, however, that was dubious. Given how she had been imprisoned and mistreated, Yoda did not fully trust that anger was banished from her heart. Yoda opposed her being elevated, especially because she had not finished her training officially yet. But PL was a vocal advocate for Yaddle, and with her permission, he went on an impassioned retelling of her story before the entire High Council. By the end of it, Yoda was convinced that she was not on the path to the dark side whatsoever, and although it was atypical, he approved of her being welcomed into the fold. Unanimously, the council lifted their lightsabers and awarded Yaddle the rank of Jedi Master, and a seat on the High Council. In Yaddle's time as a part of the Jedi, she trained many apprentices, such as Oppo Rancisis, Impadajoyous Brand, and she took part in many pivotal missions of the Republic Classic era. One event was the fight against the Nebula Front terrorist group, the Yanchori Uprising, and a political coup on Malastare, but her final mission in Legends takes place in 26 BBY. Here, Yaddle would go to the world of Mauen with Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Their mission was simply to restore peace to the lawless world which was in the throes of chaos due to one man, Granta Omega, the son of Qui-Gon's rogue apprentice. He had planned to unleash a chemical bioweapon on Mauen in a plot of revenge against the Jedi, despite Anakin's best efforts to stop it. It was Yaddle that sacrificed herself to save the people, absorbing the bioweapon. It killed her instantly, but Yaddle managed to contain it so that it would not ravage the innocent people. In terms of Yaddle's rare powers, given that she had most of her training done away from the Jedi, she ended up mastering several lesser-known powers by experience alone. Most notably, she could use the ability of Force Light, the ability to summon a bright light to banish all traces of the dark side, visually and within individuals. She was also one of the only Jedi of her era to have access to this rare ability. Even Yoda was not said to be able to summon such power. She also mastered the ability known as Morchiro, the ability to slow the vitals of organic beings to put them in a comatose state. While she avoided combat whenever necessary, Yaddle's preferred lightsaber forms were Sarisu and Dataru, and in Legends, she was one of the few Jedi to wield an orange lightsaber. Yaddle is definitely one for the books, and we're definitely pleased that she got a spotlight in the canon Tales of the Jedi series. But now at last we arrive at the man himself, Jedi Grand Master Yoda. As far as we know, Yoda is the one who retained the title of Jedi Grand Master for the longest period of time. In fact, many associate him with the title whenever it's brought up. By the time he ascended to that rank though, Yoda was considered one of the greatest and most powerful Jedi in all of galactic history, equivalent to Jedi such as Master Thrawn and Nomi Sunrider. Because he's a premier character in the Star Wars galaxy, we're going to keep his story more of a summary. Like all others of his species, Yoda's origins are obscure, but we actually learned from the Yaddle comics a piece of Yoda's history that is not shared anywhere else. When Master Evan PL was sharing Yaddle's story, Yoda interrupted to say, "Hard was life in prison for young Yaddle. Disagree, I do not. But lessons from her Jedi Master were incomplete. Lived life in solitude she did." To which PL said, "As did you, Yoda. You yourself left your village family for a solitary existence. You became a hermit, even by Jedi standards." Yoda then dryly responds that his training was complete by that point, but that Yaddle's was not. Shockingly, this gives us a tiny window into Yoda's life. He had a family once, and lived in a village on whatever homeworld the Tridactyls hail from. But we know that he was traveling in a ship with a human companion when that ship was struck by an asteroid. They then crash-landed on a swampy world where they would meet the Hysilrian hermit by the name of Nakata Del Gormo. Del Gormo, who revealed that both of them had an affinity to touch the Force. The Jedi Master invited them to become his apprentices, to be trained in the ways of a Jedi. Once their training was complete, their distress beacon was picked up by a Republic starship, and the two individuals were rescued. Yoda decided to continue his service as a Jedi, likely inspired by other members of his species before him. And so he traveled to Coruscant, where he continued to study under Grand Master Faye Kovan. By the age of 96, Yoda had become a Jedi Master, and soon joined the High Council. For the next several centuries, Yoda devoted himself to the training of many Padawans, one after another. Around 500 BBY, Yoda spent his time as a Jedi aboard the starship known as the Chuathor, which was a mobile Jedi academy that toured the galaxy with Jedi initiates. In 230 BBY, the ship crash-landed on Dathomir, where Yoda and his Jedi were forced to fight the native witches. However, the two groups ultimately came to a stalemate. Yoda conceded to their request that they leave the ship's data tapes. However, he left no means of reading the tapes, and they were bestowed to the Singing Mountain clan for safekeeping. Through the Force, Yoda foresaw a time when the Jedi would come to save the planet from darkness, and the information could be safely shared with the witches. The prophecy would be fulfilled by Luke Skywalker deep into the distant future. By 200 BBY, Yoda and several other Jedi Masters sensed that the shape of the Force had begun to flux, becoming murky and uncertain. The dark side of the Force was rising in response to the growing power of the Rule of Two, the Sith in hiding. Yoda therefore put forth the theory that the darkening of the Force may be hailing the imminent approach of the Chosen One. In opposition to the theory, several younger Jedi disputed Yoda's findings, forming a heretical sect known as Potentium. The followers of Potentium did not believe that there was a light or a dark side, but only the intentions of the user. By 130 BBY, Yoda would lead a campaign to expel them and their dangerous ideas from the Jedi Order. Around 102 BBY, a young Dooku was taken in from a wealthy family from the world of Sereno, and although Thame Cerulean was Dooku's official Jedi Master, Yoda took a particular interest in the young boy's training and became a deep confidant and advisor. Eventually, Dooku considered him to be his second Jedi Master. Within this time, he worked closely with Dooku's lightsaber training, bringing him to becoming an accomplished duelist in record time. Another Padawan of Yoda's famous lightsaber training was Sin Dralig, who would later go on to become the Battle Master at the Jedi Temple. Yoda's life allowed him to see the rise of the Jedi to a place of prominence and strength during a time of peace in the galaxy, one that they hadn't seen in ages. And he also lived long enough to see it crash and burn. His beloved student Dooku would fall to the dark side, becoming the Sith apprentice of Lord Sidious. And together, the two Sith waged the Clone Wars. Yoda used what resources he could fight back with in the growing darkness, all the while having more and more premonitions that the Jedi Order was about to fall, entering a twilight. Yoda started to recognize that the Jedi had become puffed up and arrogant, stuck in their ways because of all of their previous success and peacetime. It became apparent that their rigidity was going to be the Jedi's end. However, it was too late for Yoda to change things all by himself. He needed the help of the Chosen One. Perhaps it was Anakin, the Chosen One, to defeat the Sith and restore balance to the Force before the Jedi Order could be fixed. By the end of the Clone Wars, Yoda began hearing voices from the long-dead Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn, who had somehow retained his identity beyond death, a prospect which went against everything the Jedi thought they knew. The Council believed that it was a Sith trick, and kept Yoda on high watch. But the Jedi Grand Master escaped from his own council, following the voice of Qui-Gon to the Wellspring of Life. The Wellspring of Life is the birthplace of the midichlorians, and there, the Grand Master met 5 mysterious entities, beings calling themselves Force Priestesses, which would lead him through a training ritual where he would face his greatest fears. Yoda foresaw the end of the Jedi, the triumph of the Sith and Lord Sidious. But when he came out of this trance, he had taken his first steps into learning the ability that Qui-Gon had mastered, returning from death. Yoda kept all of this knowledge to himself, and continued to fight valiantly in the Clone Wars, hoping that he could see the signs in time to prevent the fall of the Jedi. However, he was blindsided by the fall of Anakin Skywalker, and the sudden activation of Order 66. Yoda never imagined that the weapon of the Sith was the war itself, and when he went to duel Sidious that had eluded him the entire time, it was not a battle of lightsabers and force powers. It was all futile. The war for the Jedi had already been lost. All at once, Yoda realized the Sith had won before the war ever began. They had won before he was ever Grand Master. Perhaps they had won before he was even born. The Sith won the moment they began the rule of two. With this realization, Yoda uses his many years and wisdom to realize that all hope was not lost though, that the Jedi would mirror the Sith, go into hiding, and train the next generation to return and restore peace. Into exile Yoda went, venturing to the world of Dagobah that had been erased from the Republic and the Jedi's records. Yoda would utilize the Cave of Evil that had been created by the actions of one of his fellow Tridactyls, Minch. The dark side nexus was strong enough to hide Yoda's titanic presence in the light side, so that he would not be located by the Sith. And in this time, he came to accept the faults of the Jedi, and that he required more training under a new Jedi Master, Qui-Gon Jinn. For 20 years, Yoda eagerly awaited the day when the offspring of Anakin would arrive. He was hoping to train both twins, but received only Luke, who was too old for his liking and too impulsive, reminding him far too much of Anakin, and Yoda was ultimately reluctant to train the boy. But just like Qui-Gon, the ghostly voice of Obi-Wan interceded, and Yoda agreed to ready the son of Skywalker for his destiny. For a month, Yoda trained Luke in the ways of the Force, but when the young boy received a terrifying vision of his friend's suffering, he rushed off to Cloud City, ignoring the warnings of Yoda. The Grand Master, however, held faith that either Luke would succeed, or that he could begin anew with Leia. A year would go by. Yoda would finally reach the very limits of what his species was capable of living, and apparently, that limit is 900. Yoda fell ill, and did not wish to continue using the light side to sustain his life. To cling on to life at this point would be selfish and un-Jedi-like. Yoda knew how to continue guiding Luke from beyond the grave anyhow, but he still waited for the young boy to keep his promise and to return to Dagobah. Eventually Luke did, returning as an experienced wielder of the Force. On Yoda's deathbed, he informed the boy that once he conquered Vader and the Emperor, that he would officially be a Jedi Knight. And with his final breath, he informed Luke that he was not alone, that there was another Skywalker, and thus perished the greatest member of the species of Yoda. However, Yoda was not the last. Just as Luke had another Skywalker, there was one more member of Yoda's species who exists in canon continuity, and that is Grogu. How the youngling came to be in the Jedi Order is a complete mystery. Some have speculated that he was the offspring of Yoda and Yaddle, but this is entirely unlikely. Not only did the two not appear to know each other very well, but it went against everything that they stood for as Jedi of this era. But somehow, in 41 BBY, Grogu was born and brought to be trained as a Jedi. From infancy, he was trained by many Jedi Masters, but was never able to reach completion in his training due to Order 66. As the clone troopers and Lord Vader stormed the temple, Grogu was rescued by Keller and Beck and hidden away. Years later, he was found by Nikto pirates aboard the Arvala 7. Discovered by Moff Gideon of the Imperial Remnant, Gideon hired the Mandalorian by the name of Din Djarin to retrieve the child. But upon seeing the helpless creature, the Mandalorian had a change of heart and decided to fight on its behalf, eventually adopting it into the Mandalorian creed and culture. Din Djarin would spend a great deal of time protecting the Jedi infant from the clutches of Moff Gideon, who wanted to use the child's blood as a means of cloning himself a Force-sensitive vessel. But eventually, Luke Skywalker would catch wind of Grogu's existence and would arrive to help. Luke stormed Gideon's flagship, tore through the experimental Dark Trooper droids, and rescued the Mandalorian strike team. Afterwards, he took Grogu in as his first student of a new Jedi Order, and began his training. Grogu stayed with Luke, and as his training progressed, Luke would impart on him more stories about Yoda, but it quickly became clear to him that Grogu had formed an attachment to Din Djarin. This attachment made it difficult for him to focus on training as a Jedi. Reluctantly, Luke sent the child back to the Mandalorian, and as of the writing of this video, the two remain a family. But although Grogu is still being trained as a Mandalorian foundling, there is no denying his powerful connection to the Force. It continues to call to him, and he soon must answer. His story is yet to be concluded. So, this is basically everything we know about the mysterious Yoda species, along with each individual member that has ever been shown or mentioned. They are some of the greatest natural wielders of the Force in the entire galaxy, and based on what we see here, There are a lot of theories and inferences that we can make about their society and their people, but what I appreciate most about them is that they are not perfect. While they are often the avatars of the light in their eras, they are not infallible. Even their greatest, Yoda, proves that they can have lapses in judgment. Vandar proves that they are not all-powerful. Minch proves that they are not incorruptible. And I think this makes them very special when they appear. They have the potential to be a powerful force for good, so long as they stay on the straight and narrow. This, I think, gives the story of Grogu and his journey some tension. We have already seen that his attachment to Din Djarin drives him to use powers that are both helpful and destructive. But anyway guys, I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. But before we go, we have two things to ask you. First, do you like the Tridactyl as the unofficial species name? Or do you think that assigning them a name, even as a placeholder, ruins some of the mystery of Yoda's species? And second, which member of Yoda's species do you personally find to be the most compelling? To be more specific, which one do you wish could be explored in greater detail? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. But for nearly 1,000 years, the fate of the Jedi Order rested on one individual. Yoda was not simply a teacher or a sage. As Grand Master of the Jedi, he carried responsibility for the training of generations, the preservation of Jedi knowledge, and the survival of the Order itself through centuries of instability. Every major decision the Jedi made during the final centuries of the Republic passed in some form through Yoda. And when the Jedi Order was finally destroyed, when their temple fell, and the archives burned, the galaxy turned against its protectors. It was Yoda alone who remained as the living continuity of the institution. With the Order gone, the burden of the Jedi did not vanish, but it passed to a new successor, Luke Skywalker. Luke was not merely one of Yoda's students. He became the next bearer of that great responsibility, the one charged with deciding whether the Jedi would be reborn at all, and if so, what kind of order would rise from the ashes. Through Luke, the legacy of the Jedi Grand Master continues, not as a council or a bureaucracy, but as a single line of custody stretching across generations. But this line did not begin with Yoda, and when we trace it backwards, past the Council, past the height of the Republic, past centuries of accumulated tradition, it does not lead to a grand institution or a famous lineage. It leads to a name preserved only in fragments: Rakata del Gormo. Del Gormo was a Jedi Master who had lived in a very different era, one shaped by the closing chapters of the new Sith Wars, when the Jedi Order had spent nearly 1,000 years locked in open conflict with the Sith. By the time Del Gormo appears in legend, the war has ended, the Sith were believed extinct, and the Jedi were attempting to redefine their entire role in the galaxy that they had just barely managed to save. Unlike later Grand Masters, Del Gormo does not appear as a leader of the Order though. He doesn't command armies, or sit at the center of a council. He doesn't even leave behind a lineage. If records of his service ever existed, they were likely lost in the Jedi archives when they were destroyed during Order 66, along with countless figures who operated on the fringes of the Jedi Order. What we do know is that Del Gormo was recognized as a Jedi Master that had knowledge of a wider order, and that he encountered Yoda at the very beginning of his long path, not to induct Yoda into power, but to direct him towards something greater. Del Gormo did not keep Yoda in isolation. He didn't attempt to create a rival tradition. He simply sent Yoda onward to Coruscant, to the Jedi, and ultimately towards the responsibilities that would define his life and large portions of the galaxy. Whatever Del Gormo's own path became after that, his role in Jedi history was not to rule the Order, but set the first link in the chain of those that would. From Del Gormo, to Yoda, to Luke. Unfortunately, when it comes to Rakata del Gormo, we do not have the luxury of complete records. We do not know the exact length of his life. We don't know every world that he walked. We do not know the full extent of his service to the Jedi. And that absence is deeply unusual. If Del Gormo's name was never fully cataloged in the archives, and the records were almost certainly destroyed, many figures who stood outside of the temple's central hierarchy, the Wanderers, Observers, the unorthodox maverick Jedi, were very easy to lose. In universe, the legend of Rakata del Gormo exists only as his role as Yoda's Jedi Master. His existence has not been confirmed, but according to official Lucasfilm representatives, the character of Rakata del Gormo was real. So what was he actually like? Well, although we don't have specifics, what we can do is reconstruct the type of Jedi that Del Gormo was by examining the galaxy that shaped him. Because he lived in the shadow of one of the most violent and destabilizing eras in the entire galactic history, the new Sith Wars. For nearly 1,000 years, the Sith of this era were not a unified force. They were fragmented, cobbled together, and dangerously unstable. These were not the refined Sith of later centuries or the structured empires of the earlier golden eras. They were desperate. The new Sith Wars once began with Darth Ruin, formerly the Jedi Master known as Phanius, whose fall marked the rebirth of the Sith after a millennium of dormancy. Darth Ruin was a horrific Dark Lord who would usher in this new war. Ruin didn't simply turn to the dark side, but he embraced a philosophy of absolute solipsism. He believed that only he truly existed, and that all other beings were extensions of his will. His reign ended not through Jedi justice, but with his own followers turning on him, stabbing him in the back, unable to exist within the reality that he imposed. This dangerous pattern repeated itself again and again in this time. Sith Lords rose not as careful architects of long-term power and planning, but as ideological tyrants, each wielding fragments of knowledge and incomplete philosophies. One of the more horrific examples is Belia Darzu, whose experiments with techno-beasts and dark science blurred the line between alchemy and monstrosity. Her creations reflect the state of the Sith of this era, ravenous, terrifying precisely because they lack restraint. These Sith were not weaker for their instability, but they were more dangerous. Unlike the unified Sith empires of earlier eras, such as Naga Sadow during the Great Hyperspace War, or the disciplined Sith empire of Malgus and Vitiate, the Sith of the new Sith Wars were fighting each other as often as they ever fought Jedi. They ruled through terror and obsession, belief rather than structure. Regions of space were devastated not through strategy, but through fanaticism. The Republic nearly collapsed multiple times not because the Sith were coordinated, but because they were unpredictable and seemingly everywhere. This was the Sith Order that Del Gormo's generation faced, and the Jedi were not untouched by the chaos. Over the centuries, the Jedi Order fractured internally. Jedi became generals, governors, and even hereditary lords of entire systems of space. Figures like Lord Hoth, individuals that commanded massive armies and wielded extraordinary political authority. Children were inducted into warfare. The Force itself was increasingly treated as a weapon of mass destruction. When the war finally ended on Ruusan, the Jedi emerged victorious, but deeply scarred and forever changed. Grandmaster Faye Coven presided over the past war reset, stripping the Order of much of its overt militarism and attempting to reframe the Jedi as peacekeepers yet again, rather than rulers. It was an era of reinvention, and it is within this exact moment that Nakata Del Gormo makes the most sense. We do not know the lifespan of the Hysalarian species. There are no canonical records establishing how long they live. However, it has been speculated in the fandom that Del Gormo could have lived for centuries, meaning that at the very least, he was alive during the New Sith Wars, and perhaps was even a veteran of them. If this is true, then Del Gormo's rejection of war, of the Jedi structure, and even the lightsaber become more than aesthetics. It becomes a pure reaction to the war. Del Gormo sought something more fundamental than restructure. He abandoned the tools of war and carried a Force-imbued staff. He traveled to planets rich in the Force, studying how it moved naturally, through ecosystems, through decay and renewal. Because for nearly 1,000 years, the Force had rarely been allowed to exist in this form at all. During the war, it was drawn again and again into acts of annihilation. Sith used it to tear apart and shatter armies, to collapse worlds, and impose their will on the galaxy. The Force became something pulled hard and fast, consumed in bursts of rage, obsession, and certainty. The Jedi, fighting for survival, were drawn into this same current. They used the Force to halt invasions, to crush strongholds, to hold together a republic that was fracturing. Over time, the Force ceased to be something lived alongside, and it became something to be deployed. The galaxy began to show the strain. Civilizations fell. Trade routes collapsed. Entire systems reduced to ruin. The rhythm of life across the galaxy was interrupted again and again. Worlds were devastated faster than they could recover. For a Jedi sensitive to the Force, this felt deeply wrong, unhealthy, as though the Force itself had been pushed out of balance by violence itself. By the time the war finally concluded, what remained was not a triumph, but exhaustion. And it was here, in the aftermath of this exhaustion, that Del Gormo's choice is clear. He turned away from battlefields and councils, and instead sought a place where the Force still moved freely, where death fed new growth, instead of simple conquest, where decay was not an ending, but was a part of the natural cycle. He wanted to see life return to itself, to feel the Force in soil, in water, in growth, in rot, in the quiet persistence of living systems healing. In a galaxy undone by 1,000-year war, Del Gormo chose to reconnect with the Force not as a weapon, but as life. In doing so, he echoed the ancient philosophies of Tython, when the Force was studied as balance before it was ever codified into ranks or rules. It is in this state, this stripped-down, elemental understanding of the Force, that Del Gormo would teach Yoda. Their time together was brief, we know that for sure. Yoda was not raised in exile. Del Gormo sent him onward, directing him to Coruscant and to the wider Jedi. Yoda even had a companion who crash-landed with him on the Swamp World. And the Swamp World is also important to the lore. Many once believed the world to be Dagobah. However, Li Lin-Chi has confirmed that Dagobah was not this location. Some have speculated that the world may have been Hysalria, the Hysalrian homeworld, which is also swamp-like, and located relatively close to Dagobah on galactic maps. Others argue it was simply a world rich in the Force, a place where Del Gormo could study. The truth is, we don't know. What matters is that Del Gormo was there by choice, and according to all surviving legends, and according to Yoda himself, this was his first true Jedi Master, not because of the time he spent, but because of the depth of what he learned. Yoda's training with Del Gormo may have lasted only months, but Star Wars has always told us that time is not the measure of mastery. Luke himself only trained with Yoda for a few weeks at the most. What matters is a moment, the teacher, and the state of the Force. And finally, the pattern completes itself. In the novelization for Revenge of the Sith, Yoda openly acknowledges Qui-Gon Jinn as his Jedi Master, becoming his apprentice even after his death. Yoda apologizes for not listening, for not recognizing the truth of Anakin, the Sith, and about the living Force. Like Del Gormo, Qui-Gon was unorthodox, a maverick, a Jedi who trusted the Force before any structure. Together, Del Gormo and Qui-Gon Jinn reveal something important about Yoda's story. Even the greatest Grand Masters still have lessons to learn, and often it is the outsiders, the wanderers, the listeners, who shape the most important lineages in all of Jedi history, from Del Gormo to Yoda to Luke Skywalker. This is where the story of Rakata Del Gormo becomes more than a legend, because despite how little survives about him, his influence is hiding in plain sight every time Yoda speaks. According to Frank Oz, the voice and performance behind Yoda, Yoda's unusual manner of speech was never meant to reflect his species. Oz would later tell Dave Filoni that he believed that Yoda spoke that way as a form of respect, an echo of how his master once spoke, a way to honor and remember his first teacher. Yoda reinforces this. When he rarely speaks of his time as a student, he doesn't speak of combat or dominance. He speaks of peace of mind, about learning to find calm within oneself, guiding others towards that same peace. He makes it clear that this above all is more valuable than becoming great through war or powerful through conflict. And this tells us something very important about Yoda's own master. If this was the Jedi who shaped Yoda at the beginning of his journey, then Del Gormo was likely not weak or withdrawn. He was probably immensely powerful, not because he sought power, but just like Yoda, because he did not. Because he chose to commune with the Force rather than seek to command it. Because Rakata Del Gormo understood that restraint, a balance, and a respect for life were not limitations. They were deep forms of strength. In a galaxy scarred by 1,000 years of war, Del Gormo did not try to rebuild empires or to reform institutions. He chose something simpler: to listen, to absorb, to run his fingertips through blades of grass. He chose something simpler and far more difficult to master: to listen and observe, to live with the Force as it was meant to exist. So now I'll leave it to you. What do you think Rakata Del Gormo truly represented? Was he a forgotten Jedi Master, a deliberate outsider, or the last echo of an ancient Jedi tradition that the Order had nearly lost? Let me know your thoughts, and if you would like to explore more lost figures like Yoda's master, you know where to find me. We recently covered the Rakata in the archives, a species so brutal, so catastrophically abusive in their use of the Force that even the dark side seemed to recoil from them. The Rakata did not study the Force. They did not revere it. They did not seek communion with it. They only treated it as fuel, as something to be burned, harvested, consumed through machines and slaves, stripped of all philosophy, stripped of all restraint. And because of that, the Force seemingly turned against them, A plague swept through their species, severing their very connection, collapsing their empire, and reducing what was once the infinite empire into scattered broken remnants. But Star Wars history is never absolute. There are always outliers. And today, we are talking about what may be the most powerful Rakata to ever exist, a being who stood apart from his people, who did not merely exploit the Force, but respected it, feared it, and sought to master it on a deeper level than any other Rakata before him. Because of that respect, he was granted power far beyond his kind. By the end of this video, we will explore how this member of the Rakatan species became the last and the worst embodiment of them, how he earned the title of the Infernal One, how at the height of his power, he ruled with a council that included even Sith, meaning he may have been the first darkside figure in all of Star Wars history to assemble a ruling council partially comprised of the Sith themselves. And finally, how his return was so catastrophic, so dangerous to the balance of the galaxy, that both Sith and Jedi forces united to act against him, not as allies, but as rivals united by a shared realization. Today, my friends, we will be exploring Soa, the Predator, the plague of the galaxy. But first, we must venture to the very beginning, with a different species, the Kwa. The Kwa, the very first species to elevate the Rakata, would later describe them as a plague on the stars themselves, their single greatest mistake. And they were right. The Rakata saw only one destiny: to spread across the stars, to burn world after world, to consume the galaxy until nothing remained except the infinite empire. They used the dark side to fuel weapons of war, engines of conquest, and machines of enslavement. They didn't do it out of philosophy, not even as a path to power, but as a resource to be extracted. To Rakata, the Force was not something to be understood, revered, or even respected. It was something that needed to be burned. This is where the Rakata fundamentally differ from the Sith. The Sith believe in political manipulation, in legacy, in ritual, in reverence to the dark side as a means of elevating the self above the galaxy's so-called lesser beings. But the Rakata had none of that. They were savage, they were brutal, some of the first beings to ever touch the dark side in the galaxy. And because of it, they raged. They possessed no elegance, no refinement, and no decadence. Where the Sith would later cloak themselves in ceremony and ideology, the Rakata bathed only in blood. The blood of conquered worlds, the blood of enslaved species, and eventually, even the blood of their own kind. Their slaves were not merely labor, they were fuel. Force-sensitive captives were fed into machines that converted suffering, terror, and agony directly into power. Their ships ran on literal pain, their computers ran on fear, and at the center of it all stood the Starforge, the most ancient and blasphemous engine ever created, a factory that transformed the dark side itself into endless war. And yet, even among monsters, there are aberrations, and Soa was one of them. Within the Empire, Soa rose as what is known as a Predator, a Rakatan overlord entrusted with immense authority and control over vast territories of space. Beneath him served Force Hounds, hunters whose sole purpose it was to seek out worlds rich in the Force. Rakatan hyperdrives were primitive, incapable of navigating the galaxy freely. They could only lock onto planets that had an affinity with the Force, and Soa was chief among these trailblazers. Legend suggests that Soa conquered thousands of worlds, carving a path of annihilation across Force-rich systems, expanding the Empire farther than any of his peers. But unlike the other Predators, Soa did something strange. He lingered. Where others saw only fuel, Soa actually looked closer. The Force to him was more than gasoline for the engines of genocide. He studied it, he tested its limits, and as the Force often does, it responded, granting him power far beyond what his species typically wielded. But make no mistake, this did not make Soa merciful, it did not make him wise, and it certainly did not make him good. If anything, it made him dangerous, because while other Rakata burned the galaxy indiscriminately, Soa learned how to aim the flame, and the match once struck would burn all the faster. But now, my fellow scholars of the dark side, we reach more familiar territory: Korriban, the jewel of the Infernal One. According to Soa himself, among the thousands of worlds that he conquered, one planet stood above all others: Korriban. He referred to it only as his jewel, a crown set among a galaxy already bent beneath his will. And this statement tells us something enormous in the lore. It means the Rakata did not merely discover Korriban, they didn't merely raid it, They actually conquered it. And not just any Rakata did. Soa conquered Korriban. For a time, the ancient Sith homeworld burned beneath the banner of the Infinite Empire, ruled not by a Sith king, but by a Rakatan overlord who understood the dark side well enough to recognize its value in others. Because the fall of the Rakata on Korriban is one of the most formative moments in all of Sith history. It defines them. The war that followed forced a single figure to rise above the fractured clans, a being by the name of King Adis, the warrior who united the Sith under a single banner and drove the Rakata from their world. No Rakatan name is ever explicitly recorded in Sith accounts of the war, but Soa names Korriban as his most prized conquest, and that strongly suggests the truth. It was Soa that was the tyrant who pushed the Sith to their breaking point. The wars of resistance, the campaigns against an empire that fed on suffering, would eventually wear the king down though. The body of King Adis failed. The Sith Ari, the chosen one, he passed away not in peace, but in exhaustion, forged by war against a force older and crueler than anything the Sith had faced. And yet, before Korriban was lost to the Rakata, Soa did something strange. He did not simply enslave the Sith species, but he elevated them. This is one of the most peculiar parts of the story. Soa formed what he would later call the Infernal Council, a governing body beneath him that included even Sith warriors and darkside adepts. This was not done out of respect, it was done out of recognition. Soa understood that the Sith did not merely use the dark side, they believed in it. They structured their lives around it, they worshipped it, and they sharpened themselves through it. And for Soa, it made them valuable. This is one of the most important distinctions between Soa and the rest of the Rakata. Most Rakata saw the dark side again only as fuel, but Soa saw it as a hierarchy. He saw it as the Sith would. He attempted to impose order around it, to learn from those who lived within it, to refine his own power through understanding. This is where Soa's journey becomes unsettlingly familiar. Not Rakata, not Sith, something in between. It was here on Korriban that Soa began experimenting with biological enhancement as well, crude precursors to what would later become Sith alchemy. It was not refined, but it was still unmistakably advanced. He was not a Junta Pal, he was not one of the 12 Dark Jedi, but he was early, dangerously early. And it is entirely possible that Soa kept Sith on his council not merely as rulers, but as teachers, which makes the final act all the more inevitable. Faced with extinction, King Adis united the Sith kings and war chiefs into a single fighting force, something no Sith ruler had ever achieved before. The clans rose together, not as rivals, but as a people. And at last, Korriban was reclaimed. Soa was driven from the world he prized above all others. The jewel was torn from his crown, and the loss of Korriban did not humble him, it merely marked him. Because from that moment forward, Soa was no longer merely a Rakatan conqueror, he was an exile. And exiles either fade, or they become something far worse. The Sith were the first to drive the Rakata from a world. That alone makes Korriban historic, and in the aftermath of the Sith's victory, the Sith did not just survive, but they took from the Empire as well. Rakatan starships fell into Sith hands, knowledge followed. Knowledge of interstellar travel once denied to them became possible. Even the earliest understanding of holocron construction appears to be traced back to this single era. Knowledge certainly filtered through Soa himself, offered not out of generosity, but strategy. Favor bought with secrets. And while the Rakata would dismiss the loss of Korriban as a temporary setback, the damage was already done. Because the Sith proved something that no slave species ever had before. The Rakata were not infinite, they were not immortal, and they could be hunted. Korriban became the first domino of many. Across the galaxy, cracks began to form, slave populations whispered, rebellions ignited. Worlds once cowed by terror began to test the limits of Rakatan control. The Infinite Empire still stood, vast, ancient, and terrifying, but it was no longer unquestionable. However, above every external threat, the Rakata identified one internal danger greater than all of the others: Soa himself. To the Rakata, Soa was no longer merely a predator. He was no longer a conqueror. He was an aberration. He ruled independently. He was assembling councils. He had elevated lesser beings. He studied the Force rather than burn it. And worse still, he was powerful enough to survive all of it. Whether the Rakata understood it or not, Soa was something more dangerous than rebellion. He was an evolution. It is never explicitly stated in surviving records that Soa's imprisonment marked the beginning of the Rakatan Civil War, but the timing is impossible to ignore. For the first time, Rakata turned against Rakata in a coordinated, deliberate act, not a purge of weakness, but the elimination of a rival. Soa may very well have been the first Rakata the Empire ever united to destroy. The irony is staggering. The Infinite Empire feared Soa would abandon Rakatan orthodoxy in pursuit of power, that he would seek deeper knowledge of the Force, that he would no longer be content to rule for the Empire, but instead desired to rule over it. And so, the Infinite Empire acted. The Rakata did not kill Soa though. They did something worse. They sealed him away. Soa was imprisoned on Belsavis, a world the Rakata had transformed into a planetary vault, a prison designed not for criminals, but for catastrophes. The planet housed ancient monsters, warlords, failed experiments, and beings so dangerous that annihilation was deemed too risky. Belsavis was not a tomb, it was a containment failure waiting. Using Rakatan Infinity-based technology, Force-powered stasis systems drawing from extra-dimensional principles tied to their star maps and their ancient transit sciences, the Rakata constructed what is known as the Eternity Vault. This was not a simple prison. It is a layered failsafe designed to isolate Soa from the galaxy, from the Force, and from history. Or so they believed. The same Infinity-derived technologies that allowed the Rakata to manipulate space, matter, and energy were used to bind Soa in place, using stasis fields, gravity wells, and force-dampening systems engineered not to suppress power, but only delay it, because even the Rakata did not believe that they could destroy Soa. And in doing that, they made a mistake that would echo across 20,000 years. Soa was successfully sealed away, this is true, but his connection to the Force was not dampened. It remained. While the rest of his species would later lose that connection entirely through plague and collapse, Soa remained untouched, frozen in time, preserved at the height of his power, waiting. The Rakata believed that they had prevented a catastrophe, but in reality, they simply postponed it. And with this single act, Rakata imprisoning Rakata, the Infinite Empire crossed the threshold from dominance into self-destruction. The Civil War followed. The plague followed. Lehon burned itself to ruin. But deep beneath Belsavis, the Infernal One waited. Quite ironically, the next phase of Soa's journey begins once again with his jewel, his once proud crown conquest, Korriban. It is here that the Sith of the Emperor's reborn empire chose to strike first. Not since the Great Hyperspace War under Naga Sadow had the Sith openly contested Jedi and Republic space on such a scale. Their return was not subtle. On Vitiate's command, it was an announcement written in fire. War engulfed the galaxy, and the Force was bent beneath the weight of two ancient orders colliding once more. Here we need to make a distinction. What the Jedi and Sith wield in this era would be unrecognizable to beings of the distant past, even someone as innately gifted as Soa. These are no longer primal Force users grasping at power. These are orders hardened by schisms, refined through centuries of civil war, betrayal, extinction, and rebirth. Jedi and Sith alike have become apex predators of the Force. They are disciplined, ritualized, and sharpened through endless conflict with one another. Their philosophies are rigid. Their techniques are refined. Their understanding of the Force is no longer instinctual, it is deliberate. Soa, by contrast, wields something older. Soa's power is instinctive and predatory. It is drawn from an age when the Force was not studied, but merely taken. Where the Sith channeled the dark side in doctrine and hierarchy, Soa embodies it as a force of only domination. He does not negotiate with it. He bends it, as his people once bent entire civilizations. And it is within this collision, this war between refined orders, that cracks the ancient seal holding Soa. As the Republic and the Sith Empire contest Belsavis, tearing open Rakatan vaults and prison complexes that were never meant to be disturbed, the last remnants of the Eternity Vault's containment system finally began to fail. The power reserves sustaining Soa's imprisonment, already strained by 20,000 years of entropy, fracture under bombardment, excavation, and time itself. The Infernal One awakens again. His presence does not creep back into the galaxy though, it erupts. Across the stars, the Jedi feel it as a scream, ancient, violent, alien, Sith Lords sense it as a pressure that does not bow, a will that does not submit to the Sith, a darkness that predates their empire and refuses to recognize it. There is no council convened, no treaty proposed, no alliance forged, but both sides know the same truth. Something has escaped that does not belong to either of them. The Jedi and Sith converge in the depths of the Eternity Vault, standing together not as allies but out of necessity, before an ancient evil that is stirred for the first time in 20,000 years. Soa, the Infernal One, the last true titan of the Rakata. Unlike the remnants of his species scattered across forgotten worlds, unlike the broken tribes that had long since lost the Force, Soa could still touch it. Whatever the Rakata plague stripped from his kind, it never claimed him. His connection endured, still raw, violent, unrefined, but very real. Against a lone Jedi Knight, Soa would have been overwhelming. His power was instinctive rather than studied, brutal rather than elegant. He fought like a living weapon, much in the way Grievous would later shatter Jedi expectation during the Clone War. No patience, no restraint, only forward momentum and annihilation. A single mistake would mean death. A moment's hesitation meant being crushed beneath telekinetic force, or torn apart by sheer physical dominance. Acolytes of the Sith fared no better. Many would have approached him with arrogance, believing that ancient meant obsolete. They would have learned, too late, that Soa was no relic, a being who had ruled worlds before the Sith ever had a language, before doctrine and before their hierarchy. Overconfidence would have been punished instantly. And yet, this was not a single duel. This is no test of dominance. What awaited Soa in the vault were two strike teams, comprised of Jedi Masters and Sith Lords alike, veterans of a galaxy-spanning war, honed against one another, tempered by constant conflict. These were not Force users discovering their power. They were specialists, killers, philosophers of violence. What unfolded within the Eternity Vault was not a defeat of an immortal god. It was the execution of a being who had fallen behind the evolution of the Force itself. Soa wielded power, but he did not serve the Force, nor did he understand its deeper structure as the Jedi and the Sith now did. He bent it, he consumed it, he dominated it, and for his era, that had been enough. But it was no longer enough. Blades clashed. Force energies tore through ancient stone. The vault trembled under the weight of power it had once been designed to contain. But in the end, Soa fell, not to some forgotten trick or an ancient weakness, but to the simple truth that the galaxy had moved beyond him. His defeat was final. Which blade struck the killing blow, Jedi or Sith, has been lost to history, perhaps even deliberately so. But what endured was a lesson. Soa had fled Korriban centuries earlier, driven off by King Adis and the United Sith not merely because he was defeated, but because somewhere in his dominance, he had glimpsed the future. He had seen a dark side that no longer revolved around the Rakatan chains and machines, but around a will. King Adis was that evolution, and Soa, the greatest of his kind, was a final warning. What I love about Soa is that he really is a Rakatan outlier. He's the Predator who didn't just treat the Force like gasoline, he actually paused long enough to look at it, to feel it, to push it farther than his people ever bothered to. And because of that, he was almost certainly one of their most powerful examples, if not the most powerful one. That's what makes this story great, because by the end, Star Wars makes something very clear. There are levels to this game. The Sith don't just use the dark side, they believe in it. They believe it elevated them cosmically, that it justified their rule, that because they could touch the Force, they deserved to decide the fate of everyone who could not. That belief, twisted as it was, would push them deeper. It forced them to study, to refine, and to master the dark side in ways the Rakata never attempted. The Rakata never studied. They enslaved and they consumed. They fed machines with agony and they called it mastery. But in truth, they barely scratched the surface of what the dark side actually was. So when Jedi and Sith, two orders that had spent millennia fighting, refining, and obsessing over the Force, finally stood against this ancient, terrifying prodigy, they ran the fade and they won. This wasn't because Soa was weak, far from it. It's simply because of where he reigned. Because raw power without understanding will hit a ceiling, and I think that's why Soa works so well. He's the bridge, the last Rakata who almost became something more, the one who respected the Force just enough to become terrifying, but not enough to survive what would follow him. I love the idea that he ruled Korriban for a time. I love being able to put a name and a face to the era of Rakatan dominance. It makes the moment in galactic history feel real. But with all of that said, let me ask you, do you think Soa was the true prototype of what the Sith would one day become? Or do you think the Sith surpassed the Rakata the moment they stopped treating the Force like fuel and started treating it as their destiny? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the full Rakata breakdown if you haven't already. The Shadowlands of Kashyyyk. When people think of the most dangerous places in the galaxy, they picture the worlds of the Sith, barren deserts littered with tombs, planets where the dark side is carved into the stone, worlds like Korriban, Ziost, or Droman Kos. But some of the most terrifying places in the galaxy are not the worlds that belong to the Sith. They are places the Jedi thought they understood, places they believed were alive, vibrant, and safe. Kashyyyk is one of those worlds, a planet the Jedi frequented, a world known for its beauty, its life, and its towering forests. But Kashyyyk has a second face. Hidden far below the canopy is a region so hostile that even the Jedi learned not to go there. A place where light fades, the air thickens, and the Force itself feels wrong. The Shadowlands. This is not a place corrupted by the Sith, at least not at first. It was damaged by terrors far older than them. Something ancient scarred this world, twisted its ecosystem, and left behind a darkness that never healed. And later, that darkness was perfected, because within this poisoned wilderness, the Sith would create what many consider to be their magnum opus, a war beast, a living weapon designed for one purpose, to hunt and to kill Jedi. The Shadowlands are not just dangerous, they are uniquely suited to kill, and they exist in a place you would never expect. When you land on Kashyyyk, it is already trying to kill you. Even without the Shadowlands, Kashyyyk is not a gentle world. Its forests are vertical mazes of death. Its predators are built to hunt in 3 dimensions. Its ecosystem rewards patience and brutality. Katarns stalk the upper canopies, tracking prey for days before striking. Kinrath infest the mid-levels, nesting in the dark, overwhelming victims in swarms. Massive predators cling to bark, vines, and shadow, turning every step into a gamble. This is a planet where falling is often deadlier than fighting. And yet, this was Kashyyyk before it broke. Because for all of its dangers, the forest still follows rules. Life hunts life. Predators kill to survive. Balance existed, even if it is cruel. But the Shadowlands were not always what they are now. They were made that way. When the Rakata arrived, long before the Republic, long before the Jedi, the Rakata came to the world of Kashyyyk. They did not come as explorers, they came as engineers. To the Rakata Infinite Empire, Kashyyyk is not a living world, it was a problem. Their records later revealed that the planet was deemed incompatible of sustaining the level of production that they required, and so they attempted to fix it. Terraforming engines were deployed, ecosystems were altered, natural evolution was accelerated beyond stability, and then, as if this were not enough, they placed a star map there, a device steeped in the dark side. According to the Jedi Jolee Bindo, it was this combination that doomed the Shadowlands. The terraforming machinery warped the biology of the lower forest, while the star map saturated it with dark side energy for a millennia. The Rakata eventually abandoned Kashyyyk, but the damage was done. It became a dark side nexus, but we throw that term around a lot. What is a dark side nexus? Over time, the Shadowlands became something worse than a dangerous jungle. A dark side nexus is not simply a place where evil has occurred. It is a location where the dark side accumulates, where suffering, corruption, and unnatural influence saturate the environment, where the Force no longer flows cleanly, but it pools, festers, and distorts. In places like this, life evolves and changes. Predators are more aggressive, ecosystems destabilize. This is a place where creatures who should not exist begin to thrive. For a Jedi, a nexus of this caliber is disorienting. The Force is muted, instinct fails, confidence erodes. The Shadowlands became one of these places, not intentionally, but still completely. It was a world made putrid. The Shadowlands were poisoned, unstable, dangerous for even the natives, but they were not yet optimized. It was lethal, but it had not perfected the art of killing Jedi yet. At the time, the jungle did not care who it killed, be it Jedi, Wookiee, or Beast. All are equal before it. But the Shadowlands were hostile to the Force now, but its perfect weapon will come later, because dark-side nexuses do something else. They also call out, across space, and across the Force itself. And eventually, something heard that call. Something that did not see the Shadowlands as a curse, but as a home. A new species, a species shaped to hunt Force sensitives, a species the Jedi would try time and time again and fail to erase. And when they arrived, the Shadowlands stopped being merely dangerous. It became the Jedi's end. The Warbeast was engineered far before the Sith ever turned their gaze towards Kashyyyk. The creature began before even the Sith themselves. As the first experiment, long before the Republic, during the age of the Jedi, the Force itself was not divided into light and dark. It was studied, balanced, and tested in ways that would later be considered heretical. During a time known as the Great Despot War, a Jedi master by the name of Quan Jang attempted to create a practical solution to a battlefield issue. He engineered creatures known as Tarentas, alchemical beasts capable of sensing volatile energies and hidden dangers. At first, they were merely tools. They could be controlled, useful, but something unexpected occurred. The Tarentas began to develop a taste, not simply for flesh alone, but for Force-enriched flesh. They learned that Force sensitives were different, stronger, more nourishing, more satisfying, and once that instinct takes root, it never left them. When the Sith took over, when the dark side finally asserted dominance and the Sith emerged from the schism of the 12 Dark Jedi, those early experiments didn't disappear, but they were refined, perfected even. Sith Kasai priests, tasked not with philosophy but with creation, took the Tarenta concept and reshaped it into something more aggressive, the Tarenta Tech. Unlike other war beasts, the Tarenta Tech was not designed for spectacle. It was not massive like the Leviathans. In fact, it was about the quarter size of a standard Rancor. It was not apocalyptic like the War Worms. Those creatures were devastating, but they're temporary. The Tarenta Tech was made for a more sinister purpose, to endure. It was smaller, more efficient, and that made it far more dangerous. According to the Chronicles of Sora's Sin, one of the original 12 Dark Jedi, the Tarenta Tech was one of the Kasai's most notable creations. It was bred before the year 16,899 BBY, and almost immediately, it exposed a fatal flaw in the Sith's hierarchy. The Tarenta Tech did not care who commanded it. It hunted the strongest Force presence that it could find. This meant purebloods became prey. In a society built entirely on dominance and superiority, this created pure havoc. To be the most powerful Sith in the room meant becoming a target. The Tarenta Tech did not reinforce hierarchy, but it punished it. Worse still, its behavior had social consequences as well. If the Tarenta Tech hunted you, it confirmed your power, but it also marked you. Others feared standing close to you. Others felt diminished in your presence. Some resented the danger that you attracted. This creature destabilized Sith culture simply by existing. But the Sith did not discard it simply because it worked. They turned it towards the Jedi as they realized the truth. The Tarenta Tech was never meant to enforce Sith rule. It was meant to break Jedi. When deployed against Jedi enclaves and outposts, the results were horrifyingly effective. The Tarenta Tech's hide resisted the Force. Many Force techniques failed entirely. Others provoked the creature instead of harming it. But the greatest horror was biological. Tarenta Techs fed on Force-sensitive blood. Not metaphorically, but literally. The more attuned a Jedi was to the Force, the richer the prey. And the Jedi learned something that shattered centuries of training. Using the Force only made things worse. Jedi who hunted Tarenta Techs were given a special piece of advice. Do not use the Force. Not because it didn't work, but because it would make you delicious. Every surge of the Force enriches the blood. Every technique intensified the creature's aggression. Every attempt at dominance turned into invitation. To use the Force was to season the meal. This is why Tarenta Techs were so difficult to eradicate. This is why the Great Hunt was never successful. And it is also why, when the Shadowlands of Kashyyyk became a dark side nexus, the outcome was clear. A poisoned place had finally become attractive. As it called out, the Tarenta Techs were the ones that answered, not as invaders, but as residents. The Shadowlands became a feeding ground with Exar Kun, who understood something that the Jedi did not. The Terminus wasn't just a weapon, it was a persistent weapon. When the dark side of the Force grew faint in the galaxy, the Terminus do not weaken, but they search. They are drawn instinctively towards concentrations of darkness. They migrate across worlds, burrow into caves, tombs, ruins, and scarred ecosystems where the Force has pooled unnaturally. Exar Kun exploited this. He deployed Terminus against Jedi enclaves across the galaxy. Worlds like Tatooine, Tython, Kashyyyk. Wherever Jedi attempted to establish a presence, the creatures followed. And then they fed. Entire outposts erased without siege or warning. Jedi were hunted, not fought. Their Force abilities betrayed them. Their strength made them targets. When Exar Kun was defeated though, the Terminus did not disappear. They simply went dormant. And then, the Jedi began what is known as the Great Hunt. The Jedi understood this threat too late. Jedi strike teams were sent across the galaxy to eradicate the Terminus wherever they could be found. These creatures were deemed too dangerous to be left alive. Jedi were instructed to hunt in bonded groups of 2 or 3, not for combat efficiency, but only for survival. The presence of the dark side surrounding Terminus layers was so intense that isolation meant madness or death. Even so, the Great Hunt failed in its true objective, because while many Terminus were slain, the species itself was never eliminated. When the dark side receded, the survivors did what they always did. They listened, and one place called to them louder than any other. This is why Kashyyyk answered. Many worlds cannot sustain the Terminus long term, but the Shadowlands could. The Rakata had already done their work, poisoned the lower forest, terraforming engines that had destabilized and changed the ecosystem. The star map made it worse. But unlike tombs or ruins, the Shadowlands are alive. They are an endless biomass, a permanent darkness, a self-sustaining food chain. Here the Terminus do not have to hide, they settle. What was once a deployment zone by Exar became their home. The Shadowlands are not just a forest floor of Kashyyyk, they're a second world. The Warshire trees grow so massive that their canopies blot out the sun. Light never reaches the ground. What little illumination exists comes from bioluminescent fungi and the faint glow of decay. The air is thick with spores, rot, and toxins. Breathing becomes labor. Vision is limited. Sound carries poorly. But the movement of the jungle never stops. The ecosystem is alive and it is deadly. More Kinrath infest the mid-depths, nesting in massive clusters. Shadowland Katarns, heavier, more brutal than their canopy cousins, stalk the ground. Predatory plants, venomous insects, and territorial beasts turn every step into a risk. And beneath all of it, in caves, pits, and ancient sinkholes, this is where the Terminus lie in wait. They press inward instead of flowing out. The Wookiees understood this long before the Jedi did. They don't treat the Shadowlands as territory. The Wookiee culture treats it as sacred and feared. Descent into the Shadowlands is rare, reserved for exile, ceremony, or acts of supreme courage. To face what lived below was not expected, but it was legendary. Among Wookiee clans, slaying a Terminus was considered one of the greatest feats a chieftain could accomplish. Most would fail. One such chieftain in the lore attempted to kill with Baka's ceremonial blade. He wounded the beast successfully, but the blade shattered and lodged deep into its flesh. The Terminus survived. The chieftain did not. The creature lived on, a living reminder that some trials are not meant to be conquered. During the Jedi Civil War, Revan, on the path of redemption, descended deep into the Shadowlands searching for the Starforge. Even for someone like Revan, this is not a place to dominate. Revan knew that this was a place merely to be survived. He encountered the same Terminus that had defeated a Wookiee chieftain years earlier, a creature that had survived the ritual, and Revan killed it. He recovered the broken ceremonial blade from its flesh, and he returned it to the Wookiees. Revan understood what the Shadowlands were, a place that the Jedi needed to leave untouched. By the end of the Jedi Civil War, the truth of the Shadowlands was clear. The Jedi were well aware that Terminus still existed. They knew they hibernated when the dark side waned, and they knew exactly where at least some of them were, the Shadowlands. But there was no campaign, no final purge. Even someone like Revan did not attempt to cleanse it. He didn't try to purify it. He merely survived. The Shadowlands are a place where ancient corruption has been perfected by predation and sustained by an ecosystem that actively punishes the Force. A Terminus is deadly because it does not need to land a killing blow. A single nick from its claws is enough. The venom acts fast, muscles seize, the body locks in place. If the toxin doesn't kill the victim outright, what follows will. The creature feeds, drawing out Force-enriched blood, consuming not just flesh, but life force itself. Victims are conscious long enough to feel the Force being taken from them, turned into sustenance. To use the Force in desperation only worsens it. Every surge enriches the blood. Every attempt to fight back deepens the hunger. But there is also something strange about the Shadowlands. Deep within them, there are burial grounds. They are ancient, rare, but deliberate. The Wookiees do not speak of them openly, but we do know that they exist, which raises a disturbing question. Why would the Wookiees choose to bury anyone here? We believe there are two prominent possibilities. The first is honor. These burial sites are reserved for the greatest Wookiee warriors, those rare individuals who slew a Terminus and survived. To be laid to rest there would not be punishment, but reverence. A final resting place among the deadliest trial the world can offer. This explains why so few of the burial grounds exist. The second possibility is darker. The Shadowlands are a place of removal, a final exile for the disgraced, those cast out of the clan, those whose actions place them beyond forgiveness. Wookiees are deeply symbolic. They are profoundly moral. If this interpretation is true, then the Shadowlands are not just where the great are honored, they are where the worse are erased, separated from the light of the canopy, returned to the most hostile element of their world. It is not an honor, it is an end. The Shadowlands is one of those locations in Star Wars that is fascinating and has a ton of storytelling potential. It's from a planet we already know. Kashyyyk isn't some obscure Sith world or a lost ruin, it's familiar. And yet, there's a part of it that even the Wookiees leave completely alone. The Shadowlands aren't the result of a single ideology or an empire. They're a perfect collision of mistakes. Neither the Rakata or the Sith ever planned for the Shadowlands to exist as they do now, but yet together, they created the perfect environment for the dark side to persist naturally. That's why it's so different from places like Korriban. The Jedi raid their tombs, they catalog the artifacts, they plunder their knowledge, but there's a structure, a logic. But the Shadowlands don't have any of that. There's no doctrine, no Sith code, no temples. There's nothing to be learned. It's raw, natural chaos, a dark side ecosystem formed long ago. In Star Wars, evil is usually deliberate, but here, it's a happy, terrible accident. So my friend, today's holocron leaves you with this question. What do you think the purpose of the burial sites in the Shadowlands truly are? Are they a place of supreme honor, reserved only for the greatest warriors who have conquered the darkness? Or are they a place of exile, where the worst of the worst are removed from the light of the canopy, returned to the most unforgiving part of the world? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And in the final years of the Sith Empire's great ascendancy, when the dark sciences of alchemy flourished in secrecy and ambition, there existed laboratories hidden far from the eyes of the Republic and from the Jedi, ancient chambers of experimentation, vast shadowed sanctuaries where the boundaries of life were neither respected nor observed. Within these forbidden halls, Sith alchemists labored over creations that defied any natural order. Flesh was reshaped, bone was reforged, instinct was rewritten beneath the oppressive weight of the dark side and new purpose. Among such abominations, none were regarded with greater reverence than the War Worm. The War Worm is not a numerous creation, but they were never intended to be either. Each War Worm represented an undertaking of staggering complexity, an alchemical endeavor so demanding, so ruinously costly, that even the Sith Empire at the height of its power could produce only a rare few. They were the crown jewel of Sith siege warfare, living monuments to domination through terror. Their bodies were colossal beyond proportion, vast coils of alchemically reinforced muscle encased within layers of impossibly dense, mineral-hardened flesh. Their hides bore the appearance of armored stone rather than organic tissue, surfaces that absorbed and diffused energy with unnatural resilience. Blaster fire scattered harmlessly. Conventional weapons were futile. Even the Jedi's most iconic instrument of war, the lightsaber, struggled to find its mark against such monstrous biology. Energy blades that cleaved through durasteel and severed limbs with surgical precision faltered against the worm's impenetrable hide, their incandescent arcs carving only shallow wounds across the flesh engineered specifically to endure it. To confront a war worm was to confront something the Jedi Order had scarcely imagined was possible. This was an alchemical siege engine. Greetings, lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. Today we will continue our series on Sith spawn. We have briefly covered the Terminus. We also plan on covering the Techno Beasts and the Leviathans of the ancient eras. So if you've been enjoying our breakdown and analysis on these ancient Sith weapons and beasts, then reach out and crush that subscribe button to join our order today. It is your destiny. To kill a Sith warworm, legends would whisper of extraordinary measures required to halt such monsters. Combined torrents of energy unleashed by multiple Jedi working in desperate unison, cataclysmic bombardments, weapons of the Republic of overwhelming magnitude. It was only through devastation of their own could devastation be resisted. When the Sith unveiled their warworms to the Republic, they transformed the very nature of warfare at the time. They slumbered beneath the earth like buried cataclysms, vast coils of reinforced muscle winding through subterranean darkness. Entire landscapes concealed their presence. Their arrival was rare, but it was always felt first. A deep, unnatural shudder rippled through stone and soil alike. What followed was a violent upheaval as the creatures surged upward. Earth and debris erupted skyward. Shockwaves tore through defensive lines. Fortifications lost their foundation. Battlefields became unstable realms of terror and chaos. Massive defensive structures crumbled, formations dissolved, and from the shattered ground, the worm finally revealed itself. Whispers preserved within fractured archives and forbidden teachings later suggest that the warworms did not emerge from nothing though. Their origins are in something far older, something improbable, the species known as an exogorth. These vast silicon-based predators drifting silently through asteroid fields and void dark expanses. They were among the galaxy's most enduring anomalies. Creatures sustained by radiation and mineral consumption, their immense bodies shaped by environments where life itself seemed impossible. But in them, the Sith saw great potential. Through the grotesque artistry of alchemy, the ancient biology foundation was seized and remade. Natural growth became engineered magnitude. Passive hunger became relentless aggression. Survival instinct was weaponized. What had once drifted through the cold silence of space was transformed into something bound to devastation. And among these creatures, one specimen would come to eclipse all others: the Alpha Worm. Yet this apex abomination did not fully ascend until after the Great Hyperspace War, when the Sith shattered remnants and knowledge were scattered, giving rise to darker refinements. But even before this final evolution of the warworm, the worms had already carved their territory into history. The worms were unleashed upon the Republic's most sacred and precious world, Coruscant. Across the endless cityscape where towers pierced the heavens and civilizations layered upon civilizations, the ground itself convulsed beneath unimaginable forces. Districts collapsed without warning. Foundations were shattered. Entire structures vanished into sudden, catastrophic voids. The warworms tore through city and landscape. Durasteel fortifications buckled. Urban sectors fractured. Panic rippled outward as waves of the Republic's unassailed capital was forced to confront a horror no doctrine had prepared them for. This was a complete upheaval. For the Jedi, the warworm and creatures like it stirred echoes of the past, of old heresy. While the Sith war machine wielded other instruments of terror, monstrous creations, technological horrors, and engines of planetary annihilation, few matched the warworms in sheer open devastation. Attacks from Terminus ravaged Jedi lines, Leviathans consumed their energy, but the warworms unraveled the entire battlefield. What was once a distant biological hunger within the exogorth was stripped of all natural balance, reforged into an alchemical siege engine capable of shattering vast technological fortresses. In the end, it was not the Republic that Naga Sadow had misjudged though. It was inevitably himself. For all of the terror of his creations, for all of the grotesque triumphs of alchemy, the Dark Lord's campaign faltered beneath forces that he had not foreseen. The Republic endured, the Jedi resisted, and within the fractured hierarchy of the Sith, ambition was turned inward. Ludo Kresh did not stand beside Naga Sadow. He stood against him. Betrayal, cold and decisive, fractured what remained of Sith unity. Caught between the relentless pressure of the Republic and the treachery of his rival, Naga Sadow was driven into retreat. With what remained of his Massassi followers, his shattered fleets, and the remnants of a dying empire, Sadow fled into the depths of the Outer Rim, to Yavin 4. There, amid the suffocating jungles and ancient stone, exile was now sanctuary. But sanctuary would transform into a laboratory. Upon his arrival, Naga Sadow was presented with something wholly unforeseen. Drawn by the radiation and energy signatures of his wounded vessel, a vast exogorth had attached itself to his ship's hull, a silent, monstrous passenger carried across the void, clinging to the Dark Lord's last refuge. At first, its fate seemed certain, an inconvenience to be purged, a creature to be destroyed. But exile had changed Naga Sadow. Where another may have eradicated the beast, Naga Sadow saw a possibility. Within the immense alien biology of the exogorth, he perceived the raw material for something greater, something worthy of his mastery. And so, his work began. Time, isolation, and the grotesque sciences of the dark side converged upon the creature. Flesh was reinforced, its instincts amplified. Growth was liberated from natural constraint. Hunger was weaponized. What emerged was something worse. An alpha Sith guardian worm, a creature made in exile. Across the jungles of Yavin, the creature moved. Its colossal body slithered through dense foliage and ancient ruins alike, an immense coiling presence that reshaped the land with every subterranean passage. The ground trembled in its wake, structures fractured. Entire stretches of terrain bore silent testimony to its endless search for sustenance. Where life existed, the worm fed. Where resistance started, it crushed. And where silence lingered, it waited in the dark jungle. It answered to no chain, no command structure, no mechanical restraints, only to power. Only the power of Naga Sadow. For a time, the worm stood as the Dark Lord's greatest protector, a monstrous sentinel roaming the shadowed wilderness, an embodiment of Sith dominion over flesh. But even as the echoes of the Sith Empire faded into ruin, another came seeking the forbidden legacy of the past. A challenger, a prodigy, a being whose destiny would intertwine with the ghosts of the ancient empire. When he arrived on Yavin 4, he was drawn by whispers of lost knowledge and power. But Naga Sadow did not greet him with teachings. He greeted him with a trial, the only test worthy of a true Sith. To face the Guardian Worm. The name of the one who walked into the Crucible of Terror was Exar Kun. While Naga understood the magnitude of the creature's power, he understood the brutal truth of the encounter. Should this Sith hopeful survive what loomed before him, survival would demand something beyond mastery, beyond discipline, beyond anything the Jedi or Sith of the Great Hyperspace War were ever able to achieve. The worm could not be defeated by mere elegance or technique. Its alchemically hardened hide rendered lightsaber strikes maddeningly inefficient. Victory would require something more. And so the struggle began. Exar Kun did not duel the worm. He merely attempted to outlast it. And it nearly killed him. Under the overwhelming pressure of the encounter, Exar Kun was driven towards the precipice of annihilation. Strength bled from him. Control fractured. The familiar boundaries imposed by Jedi discipline collapsed beneath the sheer, unforgiving reality of the worm's relentless pursuit and advance. And in this crucible, restraint died. What emerged was something else. Raw, unfiltered, simple. It was power. Exar Kun unleashed the dark side in a torrent of a catastrophic force, an eruption of energy that shook the temple. The air convulsed, stone fractured around them. The worm may have experienced something it never had before. Fear. It recoiled beneath a barrage of devastation unlike anything it had ever seen. The assault pushed Exar to the brink of collapse. It drained him to the edge. The effort threatened to consume him entirely, to shatter his body and his mind alike. But finally, the worm faltered. Its vast form convulsed. Its monstrous momentum finally broke beneath the sheer magnitude of Exar's unleashed fury. This is the moment where Exar Kun was no longer a Jedi or a darkside adept. Exar Kun proved himself Sith. The Guardian Worm lay in ruin, and in the wake of this impossible victory, Exar turned not only against the beast, but also against its creator. Believing he had conquered the Dark Lord's greatest weapon, Exar Kun would soon cast down the spirit of Naga Sadow himself, severing yet another remnant of the ancient empire. But now that we've covered its story, let's take a look at its anatomy. Its elongated subterranean adapted body is comprised of vast coils of crushing muscle, capable of generating catastrophic force. Vehicles crumble, terrain fractures, and the creature does not simply traverse any environment, but it actively reshapes it. At the forefront of the organism lies its most horrifying adaptation though, the maw. Its mouth is vast and circular, lined with concentrated rings of serrated teeth, each layer moving with mechanical precision. Prey drawn inward is subjected to overwhelming pressure. Its feeding behavior is relentless. It is driven by alchemically amplified predatory instinct. The warworm consumes virtually anything in its path, from organic matter to metallic structures, living beings. Its hunger is not selective or strategic, but it is constant. Nihilists would love these things. The unrestrained biology drive is precisely what renders the warworm one of the Sith's most devastating weapons. Unlike the Sith fleets, it can't be reasoned with. Unlike any soldiers, it won't be demoralized. Unlike machines, it cannot be disabled, but it only advances. It is a trump card, made to break stability. Perhaps most remarkable though, is the creature's resilience. It is extremely durable. Damage that would annihilate lesser organisms merely slow it down. To fight a warworm is to engage in a battle of attrition against something designed explicitly to outlast. The worm is among the most difficult Sith spawn creations ever engineered. The only thing more difficult than creating a warworm is killing one. For Sith, they are the apex of biology, living siege engines, engines of war, manifestations of destruction. But the warworm is only one of the expressions of this dark art. Beyond it existed creations of even greater scale, even greater terror for Jedi. Creatures designed not to devastate battlefields, but to break worlds. Next, we plan on covering the Sith Leviathans. So if you enjoy our documentation on the warworms and other Sith spawn, be sure to like this video and suggest other creatures in the comments below. We aim to explore countless monstrosities born from Sith corruption and alchemy. But now, my friend, the holocron closes. What are your thoughts on the Sith warworm, the siege engine of the old empire? Before the Sith were synonymous with lightsabers, before the galaxy learned to fear the glow of crimson blades cutting through the dark, their identity was written in something far more primitive, but in some aspects, more horrifying. We think of red lightsabers bathed in blood. We think of ancient Sith warblades, weapons adorned with jewels ripped from conquered worlds, forged from minerals harvested from long-dead systems, traded, bartered, and murdered for across Sith history. But even those weapons were not the beginning. The warblades are ancient, but they are not the first. Before alchemy ever twisted steel into instruments of cruelty, and before lightsabers became extensions of hatred, there was another creation, a weapon not born of elegance, but of brutality and savagery, of pure indiscriminate slaughter, an invention designed to tear flesh and to spread terror. In today's holocron, we descend into one of the oldest and most vicious advancements in Sith warfare, a weapon that predates the Sith's structured empire, yet was so grotesquely efficient at what it did that it endured for thousands of years, surviving all the way into the era of Exar Kun, and earning the respect of the Dark Lord Marka Ragnos. This was a weapon that was meant to mutilate, a spectacle of panic and blood. Today, my friends, we will break down the story of the Lanvarok. But before we begin, our mystics have had a terrifying vision. Many who visit the archives have not yet joined our order, so if this applies to you, reach out and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny. We have foreseen it. Now, on to the Lanvarok. What makes the Lanvarok a fascinating weapon, and one that immediately separates it from nearly every other instrument of Sith warfare, is its origins. The Lanvarok was not designed for conquest, it was purely designed for survival. The earliest Lanvaroks were not battlefield weapons carried by Dark Lords or even the Massassi shock troopers. They were tribal hunting tools. They were born in a time when the Sith were not yet emperors. They were not yet architects of galactic war, but were predators fighting to endure on a hostile world. And the weapon reflects that brutality. The first Lanvarok was towering, nearly as tall as the Massassi warriors who wielded them, a massive polearm of bone, wood, and crude forged metal built less than a refined weapon and more like an execution tool. It is framed as thick, heavy, and violently asymmetrical, crowned by a crescent-shaped axe head that curved like a talon ready to tear into flesh. Opposite the blade, a long spear-like spike jutted outward. Every edge of it promised damage. But the true horror was not in the blade, it is what it carried. Embedded along the side of the axe head sat a compact launcher, primitive in design, but devastating in effect. Within it rested multiple razor-sharp discs, each one small, curved, and wickedly thin, their edges treated with toxins meant to cripple rather than to immediately kill. A single swing would unleash them. A violent forward motion followed by the snap of returning force would send a disc screaming through the air. A wider arc transformed the weapon into something worse, a storm of spinning metal, fanning outward unpredictably, shredding anything unfortunate enough to stand within its range. Faces, throats, eyes, and etched along the weapon's surface, carved into the bone and metal alike, were inscriptions that revealed the philosophy behind the weapon's creation. If it has blood, you can make it bleed. If it has eyes, you can blind it. If it has a mouth, you can make it scream. This is not decoration, it is early Sith doctrine. Even in its early incarnation, the Lanvarok exposes something deeply unsettling about Sith psychology. Hunting for the early Sith was not about securing food or eliminating threats alone. It was about domination and terror, forcing the prey to experience fear before death. To the early Sith, pain was not a byproduct, it was a part of the point. And in this, we begin to see the earliest shadows of Sith ideology take form. The understanding that fear and power, that suffering had value, that emotions of others could be weaponized. Long before they ever had empires, the Sith were already learning to feed on the dark side. And yet, like most creations of the Sith, it did not remain static. The weapon evolved with their culture. What began as a towering instrument of battlefield terror was eventually condensed into something more insidious. Sith engineers and warriors reshaped its function, stripping away its massive polearm frame and compressing its destructive potential into a wrist-mounted gauntlet. The brutality remained, but the delivery changed. Forged of durasteel and in some instances, reinforced with cortosis, the gauntlet-mounted Lanvarok abandoned intimidation for deception. There were no more sweeping arcs or massive silhouettes dominating the battlefield. They were more subtle. A flick of the wrist, a nearly imperceptible trigger. Suddenly the air became lethal. Over time, the Lanvarok began to fade from the center of Sith identity though, and as the Empire evolved, as alchemy reshaped weapons of objects of ritual and prestige, and as lightsabers themselves slowly emerged as symbols of authority, the Lanvarok was pushed into a more specialized role. The weapon was solely wielded by the Sith subspecies class known as the Massassi. The Massassis are not soldiers of the Empire, they're something closer to living war beasts. They are brutal warriors shaped by biology and centuries of Sith manipulation. They are larger, stronger, and built for violence. They embodied the raw physical dominance that underpinned early Sith expansion. A normal Sith Lord pursues knowledge, sorcery, and political power, but the Massassi are more like living weapons. They occupy a strange, detached position within the hierarchy. They are feared but often enslaved, rarely elevated into spheres of Sith philosophy or governance. Their value is not in their intellect, but in their destruction and their obedience, as well as their capacity for cruelty. With a Lanvarok, they were suited perfectly. With its immense weight and its savage design, as well as how lethal it was, all of this aligned with the Massassi's role on the battlefield. In their hands, the weapon was less a hunting tool and became a terror device, capable of ripping through enemy lines in storms of poisoned metal. And while Sith Lords increasingly favored lightsabers, the Lanvarok never disappeared, but it became more ceremonial. It became a symbol of the past, carried by Sith Lords not as their primary instrument of war, but as a symbol of an ancient violence and heritage, of blood-soaked foundations. Even the great Marka Ragnos, Dark Lord of the Sith, possessed one, because to him it wasn't meant to be elegant, but it was a reminder, a relic of an older Sith truth, that before strategy and before philosophy, There was only the dark side, and there was terror. The final chapter of the Land Varrock is inseparable from the final chapter of the Massassi. The last time the weapon is seen in Star Wars history is also the last time the Massassi stand as a living force. When Exar Kun arrived on Yavin, he didn't find an army. He only found withered survivors, a fractured remnant of an ancient warrior species still clinging to rituals, ruins, and weapons older than most civilizations in the Republic. But even in their decline, the Massassi were brutal and efficient at war. They still carried the ancient Land Varrock. And when Exar asserted his dominance, when he bent the moon and all of its inhabitants to his will, the Massassi bowed. They did so in recognition of power, their allegiance sealed when Marka Ragnos himself marked Exar Kun as the next Dark Lord. The symbol burned into his forehead, the past anointing the future. Even Exar Kun, architect of a new evolution, master of a weapon far more complex and deadly, acknowledged the Land Varrock for what it was, calling it simple, primitive, but terrifying in its efficiency. Compared to Exar Kun's lightsaber, compared to the elegance and precision of a double-bladed weapon whose hilt matched the length of a standard lightsaber, the Land Varrock must have seemed ancient in the most literal of senses. But there was something still deeply unsettling about it. Imagine this: Republic soldiers marching in formation, disciplined, armed with the most advanced weaponry of the era. And across the battlefield, towering figures erupt forward, weapons spinning, humming, before unleashing storms of poisoned metal. A weapon of chaos. Discs tear through armor, through flesh, through faces, bodies collapsing in pieces rather than falling whole. A weapon that shreds. A weapon of mutilation. But fittingly, the end of the weapon is the most Sith ending possible. Because when Exar Kun sought to defy the Force and he attempted to transcend mortality, anchoring his existence beyond death, he turned not to his enemies, but to his followers. In a ritual of staggering cruelty, Exar Kun drained the Massassi of their life force. Every warrior, every survivor, their vitality ripped away to fuel his desperate ascension. Unlike many Sith, the Massassi did not die in battle, but they were consumed by something greater. Their extinction wasn't an accident of war, but was a sacrifice to ambition. Their master endured, but barely, trapped in the temple. And with the Massassi now gone, the Land Varrock faded with them, reduced to relics, curiosities, and fragments of a blood-soaked past. A weapon traded among collectors, smugglers, and an occasional assassin. Thus ends the long and violent legacy of the Sith's earliest invention. A weapon born first of survival uniquely, but later perfected through terror. Out of universe for a second, I really love digging into these Sith weapons. One of the coolest things about Star Wars is that you can stumble across obscure artifacts and some strange piece of technology, and when you start pulling at the thread, it unravels across the entire timeline. Suddenly you're not just looking at a weapon, but you're tracing history. You're connecting it to empires, wars, and Sith. And honestly, it's fascinating to see where the Sith were before they fully industrialized their evil. There's something about the early eras that feels medieval, ancient in a way Star Wars doesn't always get credit for. The weapons are heavier, cruder, built less around elegance and more around raw intimidation. The Land Varrock is a perfect example of the mindset. It's a version of the Sith that is brutally direct, a culture where power is expressed in fear and physical dominance, through terror that you can see unfolding on a battlefield. It doesn't have any subtlety in politics. Its violence is its own language. This mirrors our own history, because early power structures in our world is very similar. Strength-oriented, fear, presence. But over time, the brutality doesn't disappear, it just evolves. It becomes more complex, more about politics, more psychological in nature, much like the Sith themselves. But anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this obscure look at one of the Sith's first ever weapons. Far from a super weapon, but fascinating in its own right. Thank you so much for your time today, my friend, and as always, may the Force serve you. Mythology has always been one of the main drivers of Star Wars storytelling. Across the galaxy, there are many who worship higher beings and a pantheon of gods. But out in the Eternal Empire, the people of Valkorion, they they worshipped a group known as the Six Gods, a pantheon of super weapons. Greetings lore junkies, and welcome to the archives. In today's holocron, we are going to be talking about how a group of droids created a legacy of terror, one that spawned an entire religion surrounding them, a religion that Valkorion would use to rise to power. Let us begin. The Six Gods were originally created by an unknown species from the artificial world of Iokath. The Iokath architects are extremely important to the lore of Zakuul, as their technology facilitated all of Valkorion's rule. These mysterious architects are the ones who crafted the Eternal Fleet, along with many other similar superweapons of the time. Eons before the birth of the Sith and the Jedi Order, the Iokath species specialized in making weapons of mass destruction. In order to perfect their designs, the architects would test them out on unsuspecting worlds throughout the unknown regions, gathering feedback data. They then further perfected their weaponry, until it became nigh unstoppable. Despite their fascination with superweapons, they were not expansionist in nature, interestingly. In fact, there are records proving that the architects would actually pay survivors reparations, which allowed them to rebuild their civilization. But that was only so the architects could test their weapons again in the future if they desired. But among these terrible weapons was the Six Gods. These deadly machines were dispatched into the unknown regions as they lay waste to all life in their path. No one had the technology suitable enough to stop them, and they utterly annihilated hundreds of worlds. In total, the death toll exacted by the Six Gods is counted over 10 trillion beings. Among the victims of their rampage was the world of Zakuul. Somehow, a lot of the Iokath technology ended up on Zakuul. When the Eternal Fleet got out of control, the architects built a warship known as the Gravestone to shut it down, a contingency order if you will. The Eternal Throne, which controlled the fleet, was also lost along with it. The Six Gods, however, retreated to Iokath, and were not heard of for several eons. In reality, a civil war had broken out on Iokath, which ultimately led to the dwindling population of the architect species. As their superweapons turned on one another, it wasn't long before their entire race was totally wiped out, and so, all of their weaponry went into a deep slumber. However, they were definitely remembered. The tribalistic people of Zakuul were strong in the Force, but were also highly superstitious. The droid superweapons would be mythologized into their pantheon, spawning a religion that later came to be known as the Old Ways. The Six Gods were as follows. The first two gods were the parents, who ruled over the children, Isaacs the ultimate devourer and his wife, Seva. Isaacs was observed as the chief of the pantheon and the god of death. He was of course the deadliest of all of the machines. The war machine itself took several appearances of something like a massive dragon with two claws. The claws served as its primary weapon, which it used in broad swings. Isaacs was able to project a nearly impenetrable aura around himself. Even the weapons of the Republic and the Sith had difficulty bringing him down, so to the ancient civilizations of the galaxy, they stood absolutely no chance. The shield could contain its victims within a set perimeter, forcing them to confront him in close quarters with its giant claws. Other weapons included missile barrages, repulse waves, heat blast attacks, landmines, and its ultimate power, a weapon known as the Omni Cannon. The Gravestone included a cannon by the same name, and it contained the power to destroy the nearly invincible Eternal Fleet. The power of Isaacs' Omni Cannon is unknown, but it's possible that it could have had similar firepower. Isaacs was also capable of spawning tank drones to protect himself if ever necessary. Seva, the wife, was known as the Mother of Sorrows. She was much smaller and more humanoid than Isaacs and the other machines. She had a destruction accelerator that would lock onto targets and burn them down over time. She could also project orbs of energy, which she could rotate or project around herself at will. The orbs came in various colors, each dealing increasing degrees of damage. It also appears that the weapon had some form of gravity control, likely due to weaponized artificial gravity projectors. These two were said to have 4 children, the first of which was named Tyth, the god of rage. Tyth was a giant humanoid mech with gargantuan weapons that resembled a lightsaber pike. This one was more brutal in his attacks, preferring to charge and rampage with his weapon. Accompanying it were 4 kinds of droids, Guardians, which took out smaller enemies that escaped Tyth's rampage. You had the Graces, which would repair Tyth in the field, Lances, which specifically weakened deflector shields, and Justices, which would form a shield around Tyth that reflected incoming energy projectiles. The next 2 weapons went by Avela and Esne. Like their mother, they appeared as larger than average humanoid females. They often worked together, combining their primary weaponry, which were polarized energy beams. They often projected these beams in wide sweeping motions to cover as much ground and territory as possible, delivering a swath of destruction. But they could also use this as an intense way to wipe out one specific target if they desired. The last was Nahut, the Son of Shadows. Despite being extremely large, Nahut was equipped with a cloaking device and could surprise his prey. Appearing from invisibility, he would lay waste to armies with his arm-mounted blades and railgun. He was able to disrupt enemy technology and even project a field that melts flesh over time. He also seems to have inherited a gravity attack from his mother, which draws targets in and then violently rips them apart. But with the 6 gods, there was yet another entity somewhat worshipped by the people of Zakuul. We say somewhat because it was controversial to follow this figure. His name was Zildrog, the Demon Serpent. Unlike the 6 gods, Zildrog did not possess a large body with many pieces of weaponry. He was in actuality a central computer system that specialized in the transfer of life energies. The computer system actually gave life to the gravestone itself, which functioned as an extension of Zildrog. In the year 4999 BBY, Valkorion, then still known as Vitiate, would relocate the central computer of the Zildrog to his home planet of Madrias. There, he would use its power in conjunction with the Sith ritual to absorb all the life forces on the planet. This included 8,000 Sith Lords that had been lured there. With the dark side combined with this ancient technology, the Zildrog slew them all in one go, and Vitiate's ritual caused the energy to funnel directly into his body, granting him immortality and near-ultimate power. The planet of Madrias, though, was then renamed Nathema, and became completely devoid of all life, even a force signature. Following this event, Vitiate would place the Zildrog into a slumber, placing it within one of his most secretive and protected vaults. Those on Zakuul that followed the old ways believed that they were bound to serve these angry gods, and all who opposed their rule were labeled as demons and banished into the eternal swamp. However, there was a prophecy of one called the Demon Savior, who would come in the name of Zildrog and topple the rule of the old gods, ushering in a new era of prosperity for Zakuul. This savior would come in the form of Valkorion. Vitiate knew their history intimately and had been studying the planet very closely, trying to locate the Eternal Fleet. So Vitiate found a sustainable host in the form of a man by the name of Valkorion. He then hollowed the man out and transferred parts of his consciousness into the new body. He then presented himself as the Dragon of Zakuul, the demon savior to raise them from the disparity of the 6 gods. Flexing his power, Valkorion gained the worship of the citizens of Zakuul and constructed the Eternal Empire. Many millennia later, following Valkorion's demise, the 6 gods would be unleashed. The newly dubbed Eternal Alliance, the coalition of a few Jedi and Sith that helped destroy Valkorion, were forced to face each one of the gods. They managed to use their updated weaponry and combined power in the Force to take them down one at a time. However, a rogue droid from the Eternal Fleet known as the Gemini 16 would reawaken the final god, the Zildrog. He took control of the gravestone and annihilated the Eternal Fleet, before turning it to the homeworld of the Alliance. The coalition managed to find and then destroy the Zildrog's central brain, along with the Gemini 16, right before the gravestone's omnicannon could obliterate the Alliance's home. And thus, this was the final fate of the old gods. What made the 6 gods so terrifying was not just their scale, it was their purpose. These were not ancient spirits or natural manifestations of the Force. They were pure weapons. Weapons deliberately engineered by the architects of Iokath to annihilate civilizations that had not yet reached technological maturity. Each of them was capable of planetary devastation, and together they represented something far more disturbing than any Sith or Jedi. They were a cold, calculated form of destruction that stripped away all ideology. They did not conquer for power, they simply executed their function. That made them in many ways more horrifying than the Sith or even Valkorion. While a Sith may revel in domination, the 6 gods reduced worlds to nothing without emotion and without hesitation. But for the people of Zakuul, these same instruments of genocide became something else, divine. Imagine surviving an apocalypse that you cannot comprehend or understand. Imagine watching towering godlike beings descend from the sky, reshaping your world and wiping out civilizations in moments. To a primitive people, there was no other explanation. The survivors did not just fear the Six, they worshipped them. They built around them an entire belief system. The old ways, the idea that suffering was sacred, and that the lives belonged to the Six gods, that their fate was dedicated by forces beyond comprehension. Pain was not to be resisted, it was something that had to be accepted. And in that belief, the Six gods became more than destroyers. They became the foundation of Zakuulian identity. But of course, what is most fascinating is how they were rewritten by Valkorion, the hidden form of Vitiate. He didn't defeat the old ways, but he changed them. The prophecy of the demon savior was not his creation, but he understood its power and importance immediately. By presenting himself as the one destined to overthrow Isaacs, he positioned himself not as an outsider, but as a fulfillment of the Zakuulian people's deepest belief. He completed their religion. When he did that, he achieved something no conqueror ever had: total ideological control. The people of Zakuul didn't accept him, they worshipped him. They were six engines of destruction, but they were replaced by something far stronger, something smarter. Valkorion saw what the people feared, what they worshipped, what they hoped for, and he reshaped it all to a worship of himself, placing himself as the central figure of their destiny. The old gods brought Zakuul to its knees, but Valkorion made sure that they would never rise without him. I do really like the trope of ancient builders creating terrors that future generations are then forced to deal with in Star Wars lore, and I do think that these droid superweapons that ultimately become worshipped as deities is definitely an interesting angle. You fight each of these monsters in the special raid events of the Old Republic, and what's most fascinating is when you listen to the dialogue of the droids, they too have begun to think of themselves as divine. So we have these sentient weapons of mass destruction with god complexes threatening all of sentient life with no masters to control them. I hope one day this concept is fleshed out more in a story, and if you agree, let me know in the comments down below. But what are your thoughts on the six gods, and how Valkorion ultimately used them to manipulate and conquer the people of Zakuul? Were you aware of these six terrifying deities before this video? And if not, let me know what you think down below. We believe that General Grievous's species had the potential to become the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, but that the Jedi ruined it. Greetings again, Acolytes and Lore Junkies, and welcome back to the Archives. When taking inventory of the various alien species of the galaxy, we find that there are many who can be considered the greatest threat to sentient life. We have the Rakata, who wielded the dark side with enough complexity to create force-based machinery that they used to conquer the known galaxy in their heyday. Then we have the Ruvi, who could siphon the soul of living beings to power their own technology. And then of course, you have the Yuuzhan Vong, who are immune to the Force and operate using organic machinery. But all of these war-loving people have something that Grievous's species did not have, and that is a chance to develop. Left to their own devices, they progressed enough to build empires that nearly brought the galaxy to their knees. And we think that the Kaleesh could have had the chance to do the same thing, if not for the intervention of the Jedi Knights. It's likely that General Grievous knew this as well, which was one of the many reasons he hated the Jedi so much, and he may be more justified in that than we initially thought. So join us today as we analyze the Kaleesh and talk about how they could have been an empire entirely comprised of beings as dangerous as Grievous himself. The world of Kalee rests in wild space, which is the largely unexplored area in the Outer Rim, one that has an off-and-on relationship to Republic space. Kalee itself rests on the very fringes of wild space, and was considered an unremarkable backwater world by the Republic for a very long time. Little did the Republic know how powerful the natives were. The Kaleesh people were a reptilian species that seemed to be genetically evolved for one thing, and that was combat. They had tough, scaly skin with which to resist melee blows. Their clawed hands featured two thumbs that could grip any weapon with tighter control than most humanoids. Due to thermal pits under their eyes, they had night vision, and their sense of smell was keen as a canine, but you would seldom know this. Many outsiders are not aware of these factors because the Kaleesh keep themselves covered. Their faces specifically are almost always hidden by a mask made of pure bone. These were known as Mumu masks, created from the skulls of creatures of the same name. The Mumu were dangerous tusk beasts native to the world of Kalee. They were renowned for their incredibly thick hides, tough backbones, and two hearts that gave them excellent survivability. the Kaleesh would become masters of hunting these beings. It was considered a sacred rite of passage for warriors to kill his or her first mumu by themselves. They accomplished this by crafting Shawnee spears made from the bones of swordfish-type creatures. These spears were sharp enough to pierce the hide of a mumu, and the Kaleesh found themselves as a culture honoring the entire process, honoring both the weapon and the use of it. Symbolism for the contest between sea and land. War and struggle was a large part of the Kaleesh culture. Much like the ancient Sith purebloods, war to them was not seen as an abhorrent thing, but something as regular as peacetime. The Kaleesh believed in the survival of the fittest, and so would constantly hone their bodies to be the most dangerous predators on their planet. Also, much like the ancient Mandalorians, the Kaleesh conquered their own planet despite being rather primitive in development. After setting themselves up at the top of the food chain, their next conquest would be one another. And so their tribes often went to war with one another unless there existed a common enemy for all Kaleesh to rally around. This was because to them, war was viewed not only as sacred, but essential. They were a highly religious people, believing that those who performed great deeds in life or in war would become gods after their death. Therefore, burial places were considered holy to them, and they worshipped their warrior ancestors as gods. Because of this religion, the Kaleesh were spiritually devoted to becoming the most adept warriors possible, so that they too may ascend to divinity upon their death. As an aside, by the time of the New Republic, General Grievous had been placed as a god in the Kaleesh pantheon, following his death by Obi-Wan Kenobi on Utapau, a great detail. For many years, the people used only primitive weapons, until the Republic took notice of them following the Great Galactic War, when Darth Vitiate's empire had returned. There were a few Force-sensitive Kaleesh that left their homeworld, and either joined the Jedi, or joined with the Sith. Men such as the individual known as Zalek and Shakran Sanjuki became Lords of the Sith and terrors of the battlefield. Zalek himself chose to wield a saber staff and was a cut above most Sith warriors of the day. The Jedi would become more and more aware of the Kaleesh due to Master Sin Taikan, who was a survival expert in the Jedi Order. His understanding of how to navigate and survive dangerous environments became integral in his position as a Republic operative during the war. The Jedi chose not to take any Padawans until he found one that shared a deep bond with him. A deep bond with the survivalist nature. However, the planet of Kali itself would not become a target of the Republic interest until the year 65 BBY, when the Republic decided to exploit the power of the Kaleesh people. At this point in time, the Republic had been having trouble with the planet of Gaitekia, the homeworld of the Bithvarians, because the planet refused to formally join the Republic, and they controlled the region of space known as the Kodak region, which comprised a reasonable amount of wild space. After several years of failed negotiations, a Republic-backed soldier attempted to stage a coup against the Gaiteka's leader in order to force the planet to join the Republic. The attempt failed, however, and caused a surge of violence and hostility towards all Republic stations within the surrounding region of space. The Republic wanted to keep this conflict as secret as possible, so that it wouldn't make them all look bad. So rather than making noise by having their own forces terminate the rebellion, they instead turned to the Kaleesh, convincing them that they were in danger. The Republic quietly sent a group of military instructors to the world, along with several Jedi. The Republic armed the Kaleesh military force with updated weaponry. They now went from bows and slings as their ranged weaponry to slug thrower and outland rifles. Using only the Kaleesh military led by a small group of Jedi Knights, they were able to completely shut down the entire Bithvarian war, swiftly defeating the army of the Kodak region. Most notably, General Grievous's grandmother participated in the war. It is important to note that the Bithvarians were a technologically advanced species, possessing both blasters and starfighters. While the Kaleesh did have interstellar flight and hyperspace capability, we do not have information that suggests they possessed a powerful navy at all. They were not exactly tech-savvy, and kept largely to their more primitive ways, only accepting whatever technology was given to them, rather than developing their own, at least as far as we can tell in the lore. Information and images on the Kali are unfortunately very limited, and what technology we do see that they have is often outdated and simple, with their only means of interstellar transportation being limited to older shuttles. But this all goes to show just how powerful and ambitious they were as a coherent army, especially when facing a more advanced enemy. After swindling the Kaleesh into doing their dirty work, The Jedi and the Republic simply left, allowing them to keep their Zerka rifles. But this wouldn't be the first time the Kaleesh triumphed over a more developed species. For a few more years, the Republic paid little attention to the world of Kalee. After all, even though they were a powerful people, they showed no signs of progressing soon. But that could have all changed during the Huk War of the year 60 BBY. For decades, the technologically advanced insectoid species known as the Ymiri invaded Kaleesh. They had become overpopulated on their own industrial homeworld, and so they were capturing other systems and enslaving the inhabitants there. They attempted to invade Kalee and take the strong warrior people by force, and while they succeeded in capturing many slaves, the Kaleesh rose up and fought them time and time again over the course of many years. This war would ultimately become known as the Huk War. The term Huk was a slur made by the Kaleesh to mean soulless bug. Eventually, a young Kaleesh boy named Kaimain Jai Shilal would grow up during this era of war. His father taught him how to kill the insectoid Ymiri with a Zerka rifle, and he grew up as an excellent marksman. By 8 years of age, he had already become an expert sniper with more than 40 Huk kills to his credit. By the age of 22, he had slain so many Huk that the Kaleesh people considered Shilal to be a demigod. At his side was Ronderu Lij Kumar, another fantastic warrior who wielded 2 Lig swords. Shilal taught her marksmanship, and she taught him swordplay. Together, the two of them used their complementary skills to slay hordes of Huk soldiers through countless battles. They became the thing of legend to the Kaleesh people, and all of the warriors rallied behind them in the war. However, in a single engagement on the beaches of Kalee, the two of them were separated. Kumar died violently on the Huk's barbed spears, and her body vanished into the Janua Sea. Shilal, unable to retrieve her body from the waters, was driven into a terrible depression. Inconsolable, he set across a dangerous ocean known as Ebesmi, an island monolith far from the mainland. There, he beseeched the gods to raise her from her watery grave, just so that he may see her one final time. But the gods remained silent. No matter how many wives or children that he took, he was unable to fill the void left behind by Kumar, and so he renamed himself Grievous, and became one of the most terrifying warlords Wild Space had seen since Zim the Despot. He gathered to himself a group of equally desperate and bloodthirsty warriors who he named the Isvoshra, which is the Kaleesh word for my elite. Furthermore, he organized the army and divided it into 8 divisions. Then he began his rampage. Grievous managed to force the Huk from the world of Kalee, something that had not happened in decades. But the warlord's bitterness did not end here. He pushed them further back, storming their colony worlds. The Huk were entirely devastated, driven back by a superior species. Grievous would then use their technology and ships for himself. He continued capturing all of their systems, attacking both their colonists and the Huk homeworld until the Ymiri reached out to the Republic in a desperate plea for help. Jedi Masters T'Chaka Dun and Jamar led a Jedi task force of 50 Jedi Knights and Jedi Masters that were sent to stop the war. After deep meditation, they ended up siding with the Huk. It is unknown whether or not the Jedi were simply deceived by the plight of the Huk, or if they were acting on the will of the Senate. But it stands to reason that the Republic greatly feared the Kaleesh's warriors. Despite being a primitive people, they had taken Wild Space by storm. Led by this Grievous, they had advanced decades in their technology, and they showed no signs of slowing down. So it is our theory that the Republic swayed the Jedi's opinion to side with the Huk, in order to keep a lid on this warrior people. As such, they levied hefty reparations and embargoes on the Kaleesh. They had to give up all of the territories that they conquered, paying fines to the Huk who had tried to enslave them. And so, despite winning their freedom, they still became slaves in a way, all thanks to the Jedi. Grievous watched as his planet descended into poverty, and hundreds of thousands of his people died of starvation, unable to pass away even in the glory of war. From this moment, Grievous swore to do anything necessary to become equal to the might of the Jedi, to get revenge on them for the injustice that they had done to his people. The power of the Kaleesh could not be stopped by any army, any technology, or any weapon. It literally required a massive fighting force of Jedi Knights and Jedi Masters, the peacekeepers of the galaxy, to stop a Kaleesh rampage. By now they had begun to gather technology, and we believe that had they not been stopped, they could have ended up as one of the most dangerous beings in the entire galaxy. The corrupt side of the Republic was only able to prevent this outcome by cutting off the Kalish's head while they were still young and primitive. What makes them so dangerous is that while they were a warlike people, they were not simple brutes at all. They were sharply intelligent, tactically minded. They could pick up and learn any weapon with ease, just how they did with the Circa rifle, how Ronderu taught Kaimain how to use swords, and how Grievous learned to use the lightsaber despite not being force sensitive. They were dangerous because of how quickly they caught on to technology. When Grievous adapted to the Hux tech, he integrated it with his army and his people, and they began to use it extremely efficiently. Their survival-based instincts and mentality allows them to use any tool to its fullest, no matter how simple or how advanced. And if that weren't enough, they were religiously and spiritually devoted to warfare. Being the best fighter was not good enough for them. They were reaching for divinity through war and through combat. The Sith proved that no being with that kind of mentality are ever complacent with their current skill level. Had their people not been mass executed via starvation, it might have blazed into an empire of wild space. Their empire could have been unstoppable, and even the Republic would have been hard-pressed to fight them. All they required was a strong leader like Grievous, and each one of them could have had the capacity to become just like him, minus the cybernetics of course. But my friends, this was our thoughts on General Grievous and his species, and how they were simply cut from a different cloth. It's really a shame what happened to them, and it goes to show what kind of corruption the Republic was consumed with towards the end of its life. If you'd like us taking a look at the lesser explored people of the galaxy, be sure to comment down below who else you want us to analyze. We've done the Hutts and now the Kalish. There are definitely no shortage of powerful species out there. So until next time, may the Force be with you, and have an amazing day. Generally speaking, attempting to clone Force sensitives is a bad idea. Greetings again, Acolytes and lore junkies, and welcome to the Archives. Throughout the lore in both Legends and canon, one thing has remained politely consistent. It is next to impossible to fully make a clone of a Jedi or a Sith. For some odd reason, the Force just seems to reject the cloning process, and assuming the experiments even survive incubation, the results are often disastrous. In today's Holocron, we are going to recount all of the horrors of Force-sensitive cloning gone wrong. But with that, we will take a peek at when and did it work out to see the differences. Let's begin. Oftentimes, when Force sensitives are cloned, the first major defect is often physical. Something about midichlorian dysregulation creates deformities in the subjects. They can emerge looking thin and emaciated, or limbs are often grossly disproportionate, or they will suffer growths and tumors that will ultimately kill them. When observing the deranged Starkiller clones, most of their deformities cause volatile lashing of Force energy to explode out of them uncontrollably, making them a danger to themselves and everyone around them. But even after passing the physical aspect, the real issue that remains ever present is the mental factor. On the milder end, clones can suffer from disabilities that render them catatonic. In the worst, and unfortunately the most common of cases, clones will suffer from intense madness. But at the moment, what remains unclear is that if this is a product of the Force power incompatibility, or rather it is the method by which Force-sensitive duplicates are brought about. For most of galactic history, cloning technology was highly experimental and not widely used. Cloning regular subjects is not seen very frequently in the era of the Old Republic. The first society to really perfect the practice were the Kaminoans, who began on livestock and then used it to preserve their own race, and eventually came to selling their services as a trade. The thought to attempt to clone a Force-sensitive did not occur to the Kaminoans until they were deeply engrossed with the Jedi. In some private documented files, it has been revealed that the Kaminoans had a hidden fascination at the prospect of cloning Jedi. But all experiments of this nature were kept highly classified. The Jedi themselves were not keen on allowing their members to be cloned, believing that the power of the Force in the individual should be something that the Force chooses, not something that mortals replicate. But that did not stop the Kaminoans from trying, and we'll talk about their results when we get to the actually successful experiments. With that being said, they weren't the ones who tried first. It was none other than Palpatine. Frequent attempts in this field wouldn't start being regularly made until the late Clone Wars era into the Imperial era and beyond. And this is where we want to begin our deeper analysis with Joruus C'baoth. The original Joruus C'baoth was a Jedi Master who led an expedition known as the Outbound Flight. This was meant to explore the unknown regions, but before he took off, Chancellor Palpatine had tissue and blood samples taken from him and his crew of Jedi as well as Republic officers. This was under the guise of keeping samples for study in case they came back with undocumented diseases. However, Palpatine fully intended on their disappearance, and indeed, the Outbound Flight was taken out by the Chiss Ascendancy under the leadership and direction of Thrawn. At this point in time, Darth Sidious was interested in the prospect of immortality through cloning, so he decided to experiment with C'baoth's DNA first. Since the Kaminoans were so guarded about their methods, and Palpatine wanted faster results, he would obtain cloning technology from Kartau. These were the cloners who used techniques from an ancient race known as the Calmites, who were much like the Kaminoans in that they bred their race from clones and believed that they had achieved perfection through doing it. Their tech was known as the Sparti cloning cylinders, tubes which were able to generate duplicates in a fraction of the time as the traditional Kaminoan cloning methods. During the heat of the Clone Wars, the Republic began supplementing their forces with Sparti clones to keep up with the endless production of battle droids on the opposition. These unique cylinders allowed the Empire to grow clones within only a year, 10 times faster than that of the Kaminoans. Additionally, the Sparti clones had their minds formed by a process known as flash memory. Flash memory involves writing the memories of another trooper to the fresh clone's brain. Of course, the memories of that trooper were usually one of an exceptionally loyal, disciplined, and a skilled warrior. So there were clones from a variety of templates, all being produced within a single year and sharing the memories of only one or a few of the actual troopers. Rather impressive, but also, as we'll see, extremely problematic. Clones grown in the Sparti cylinders were notoriously unstable, and any clones that are incubated and grown in less than a year inevitably went insane. There was a reason that the Kaminoans took their time and capped off the acceleration at just 10 years. The flash memory process frequently resulted in brain damage. Even when it was successful, the final results were far inferior to the Kaminoan method of combat training. Many of the Sparti clones lacked proper intelligence and personalities, resulting in them failing to do so much as take cover in combat. The cloning cylinders were officially put out of commission by the Republic once they were destroyed during the Battle of Kartau, but Palpatine kept a few for himself. During the Empire, the Emperor would try to supplement the degrading Jango Fett clones with those from the Sparti method, but just like before, this was horribly ineffectual. But when the Clone Wars was going on, this technology was still new, and Sidious's hopes were high. On his secret vault world of Wayland, Palpatine successfully brought about the clone of the Jedi Master Joruus C'baoth, and placed him in charge of the world for the time being. Joruus C'baoth from the flash memory process had all of the knowledge of the original, and continued to cultivate his force training as well. However, he eventually went mad, as the Sparti clones are prone to do, and embraced the dark side. He took to dominating and punishing the native people with the Force in order to keep them in line, and despite claiming himself to be a Jedi Master, he was a dark Jedi through and through. After the fall of the Empire, C'baoth would come under the employment of Grand Admiral Thrawn. The two struck a deal that Joruus would use his battle meditation to help coordinate Thrawn's ship in the battle, and in return, Thrawn would deliver him the Skywalkers. Joruus C'baoth desired to use Luke, Leia, and Leia's children to start his own twisted, dark iteration of the Jedi. However, both Thrawn's agents and C'baoth himself repeatedly failed to capture and hold the Skywalkers. More than once, the mad clone lashed out at Thrawn with his powers in the Force, but the Grand Admiral rebuffed his attacks through the use of the Ysalamiri. The Ysalamiri were living creatures that could project a Force nullification bubble. While wearing one of these around his shoulders, Thrawn was immune to having his thoughts sensed, his will disturbed, and even Force attacks, including C'baoth's Force lightning. All of it fizzled out before it reached Thrawn. To circumvent Thrawn and to get what he desired though, Joruus ended up mind-controlling Thrawn's subordinate, Captain Pellaeon, and with his help, C'baoth was able to gain access to Luke's severed hand and lightsaber, the lightsaber that had been recovered from Cloud City by Darth Vader years prior. Using this DNA, C'baoth used the Sparti cylinders to clone his own Skywalker. This brought forth Luke, which is just Luke's name but spelled with 2 U's. Just like with the other clones, Luke was also insane, but in a more rabid way. By the time Luke Skywalker and Mara Jade confronted C'baoth in Palpatine's mountain vault, Luke was forced to fight his clone, who was using the lightsaber of Anakin Skywalker. The clone fought viciously, ruthlessly attacking Luke and keeping him on the back foot, mixing aggressive lightsaber techniques and saber throws. Luke noted that Luke was equal to him in both power and skill, but was completely unstable. It was only with the help of Mara Jade that Luke managed to kill his doppelganger. Afterwards, the enraged Jorah Sabaoth unleashed his power in a mad frenzy, fully succumbing to insanity-induced rampage. Mara and Luke both slew him before he managed to bring the entire mountain vault down around on top of them. Luke Skywalker would end up traumatized by his encounter with the clone, and in the weeks following the duel, he lost sleep over it. He couldn't get over how fighting him exactly was like fighting a version from himself on Dagobah, and Luke fretted about how easily his clone had succumbed to the dark side, concerning him that he had the capacity to do the exact same. The accelerated growth of Sabaoth and Luke seemed to be the greatest to blame for their poor conditioning, even if they were physically stable for quite a while. However, this would not be the last time that Force sensitives were cloned in such a short amount of time, and this is where we start getting into the inspiration for this video. One cannot speak of this subject for long without addressing the clones of Galen Marek. This was the first time that a cloning program for a Force sensitive was actually taken seriously, and for an entire year, it became Vader's keen obsession. On Kamino, Vader did everything he could with their experimental technology to replicate his fallen apprentice. Galen Marek had been the finest of investments, a potential that only appears a few times every millennium. He couldn't simply let all of that power and training go to waste just because the original apprentice decided to be a turncoat. After Galen's sacrificial death, Vader used his corpse to create a program that would reboot his apprentice, but this time, without the emotional attachments of the original. Many obstacles hindered the project's success rate, the first of which was that even the hyper-accelerated Sparty method was not good enough for Darth Vader. Under his directives, the scientists resorted to using an experimental procedure that produced full-grown subjects in just a few weeks. The initial test subjects were physically deformed and driven insane by the inherent memories of their progenitor. Failure after failure occurred, with it soon being theorized that perhaps the Force itself fundamentally hindered the cloning process of a Force-sensitive host. But eventually, progress was made. The procedure was gradually improved by the lead cloning technician, who succeeded in creating a new batch of clones that more accurately resembled Galen. Nevertheless, yet another big problem quickly presented itself. In order for the new apprentices to utilize the inherent Force powers and combat skills of the original, Marek's memories would have to be imprinted on his replacement's own brain, transferring his knowledge and experience to his clone. This was a much more improved version of the flash memory that didn't result in any brain damage, but it still had terrible psychological effects. Many of the clones developed an identity crisis as a result of possessing the memories and emotions of another person. Even if they failed though, Vader decided not to destroy these clones, but simply sequester them away into stasis tanks for later use or research. But they would eventually become somewhat useful when Vader actually made a breakthrough with Subject 1138. Vader had personally trained all of the most promising candidates until one emerged among the rest. This is where we start to tip into the clones that were technically successful, but that comes with an asterisk. 1138 was the only Starkiller clone that seemed physically, mentally, and emotionally stable, and while his identity crisis was still present, it didn't threaten to destroy his mind. Having said that, he was perhaps too much like the original, leaning into rebellion by escaping Kamino and running off to find his friends from his old memories. We do have to add a disclaimer here. It is currently subject to conjecture whether this should be considered a successful clone or not. To this very day, it remains ambiguous as to whether or not this Starkiller is a clone at all. There are multiple pieces of evidence to suggest that this is actually the real Galen Marek somehow having been resurrected, but convinced that he is a clone by Vader as a manipulation tactic. For one thing, the original Starkiller is referred to as Subject 1138 in the first Force Unleashed game, most notably when he was escaping the hospital ship. For another, Jedi General Rom Koda was convinced that he was the original when seeing him and perceiving him through the Force. The third, Vader seemed keenly interested in finding and utilizing Subject 1138 despite finally creating the very clone that he always desired. This is when we get into a fully functional Force-sensitive clone. While the Dark Lord worked to recover Subject 1138, he continued his experiments, eventually coming out the other side with what is known as the Dark Apprentice. The Dark Apprentice is everything that Vader always wanted. Galen Marek with the same memories, but none of the emotions. He was ruthless and cruel, only feeling disgust at the weakness of his former incarnation. He had no qualms executing a hologram of Juno, the love of his progenitor. He was kept secret as a backup plan in case Subject 1138 attempted to execute Vader. This is the most curious piece of the lore, since it would only make sense for the Dark Lord to simply toss away 1138 if he found success with another clone. The only reason he would consider this other Starkiller to have any value is if he may be the original. But that's just our theory. Let's move on with more clones. Speaking of the Dark Lord, Vader himself would not be immune to cloning against his wishes in the months following the Battle of Yavin. Despite what you may think, Sidious had nothing to do with it though. At some point, Vader had visited some ancient Jedi ruins on Tatooine, those that housed an active, experimental cloning facility. Apparently, the Jedi did experiment with cloning Force wielders at some point, but as the story pans out, it becomes clear why they shut it down and refused to allow the Kaminoans to clone them in the first place. In this trip, Vader was ambushed by security turrets, which wiped out his squad and put him on the defensive. Considering these turrets were meant to protect the ruins of the Jedi, it's likely that they were constructed to fire at Force wielders. What's shocking here is Vader actually suffered a wound from one of them and was forced to retreat, but in his wake, he left a few drops of blood. The cloning droids, now running on autopilot, created a genetically similar clone to Darth Vader, and using currently mysterious techniques, they managed to imprint the duplicate with the Dark Lord's personality. Due to the faulty functionality of the facility though, the clone of Vader was only partially mentally functional, which meant he was all personality and instinct and no intellect. The clone did not require a suit, but the facility created one anyway to more accurately duplicate the original. The costume was created from scrap around the broken down temple, and it did not function well, but was purely aesthetic, as was the clone's lightsaber. Vader returned to the facility in the year 0 ABY in pursuit of Force-sensitive children, Tash Aranda and Zach Aranda, along with their guide, Professor Mammon Hool. During the engagement, Vader encountered this faulty clone, and the two entered a duel. It very quickly, however, became apparent that this faulty copy also lacked the full power of the Dark Lord. The children and their guardian escaped while Vader was busy as he slew his doppelganger. However, like Luke, Vader was left deeply troubled by the experience and contemplated the nature of cloning before departing the world. There was yet one more Force-sensitive cloning event that Vader would be involved in. The Dark Lord was sent on a mission by his master, who also dispatched his most loyal Emperor's hand, Saw Qus. Qus was sent to ambush Vader as a test. The Sith Lord easily bested the Emperor's hand, but commended him for his combat prowess and gave him the opportunity to work for him instead. Qus, however, refused, choosing death over betrayal. While Vader did not kill him, he still admired the man's loyalty, and so he sought to clone him in order to create a private army of Dark Jedi, those who would exhibit the same courage and devotion. After more than a year of replicating the Qus genome, the Empire had produced 6 prototype clones of Saw Qus, fully grown and trained as Imperial stormtroopers. They lived long enough to prove physically and mentally stable, but both Sith Lords kept them under careful watch. Although they wore the same standard armor as the clone infantry units of the Stormtrooper Corps, the Qus clones were armored with red lightsabers. In addition to their skills in melee, the clones also learned to harness their inherited Force abilities as well. After their maturation stage was complete, the Qus clones received their training in an Imperial training center located on the planet of Yin Chor. Both Emperor Sidious and Vader closely monitored the development of the Qus clones, but most of their practical instruction was handled by another hand by the name of Shay Van. The Sith Lords personally oversaw the clones during the final stage of their trials. They demonstrated their lightsaber skills against one another, as well as against Darth Vader, while the Emperor actively observed their performance. The Emperor was sufficiently pleased with the result of his new Force-sensitive stormtroopers, and instructed Vader to place an order with the Arcanians for an entire battalion of Qus clones. But unbeknownst to them, the hand who was training them, Shay Van, wanted to overthrow Sidious. The clones admitted to being loyal only to the one who trained them, which was Shay Van, and he was secretly preparing for a coup. Their instruction came as a great surprise to the Imperials, with the exception of the Emperor, who Vader observed to be suspiciously calm given the situation. The Qus clones attacked the Sith Lords and their Imperial escorts in a shuttle. None of the clones, nor their master Shay Van, were capable of besting Vader in a duel, and it wasn't long before the Dark Lord slew each and every one of them. Though the battle came at the price of the closest thing the Dark Lord had to a friend, Lieutenant Irv Lakoff, There are only a few more Force-sensitive clones to account for, which we would call successful. We mentioned earlier that the Kaminoans did have some success with replicating Jedi. This happened in the case of the clone brothers known as X1 and X2. Prior to the outbreak of the Clone Wars, Master Rom Koda and his apprentice, Jedi Knight Fallon Gray, came under fire while on a mission. Gray was severely injured, and Koda brought him to the nearest system available for immediate medical attention. Ironically, it would end up being Kamino, the birthplace of the Jango Fett army that he would soon come to despise. Koda begged them to help his Padawan, and the scientist obliged. However, as payment, they took a sample from Fallon Gray without either Jedi's consent. In the years following, they successfully produced X1 and X2, twin brothers who were then placed in a mix of the Jango Fett clones. The two flew under the radar during the Clone Wars, and were never discovered as being different by their Jedi commanders for the entirety of the war. But come Order 66, and the paths of the brothers would diverge. X1 followed orders, while X2 rejected them. This fundamental split would lead each one down a path of allegiance to the opposite sides of the Force, one light and one dark. X1 used what was left over from Darth Vader's legacy to fashion himself into a Sith Lord, while his younger brother took the path of the Jedi. X1's plan was to create a cloning facility where he would make an entire army of Force-wielding clones to dominate the galaxy. However, with the help of Jedi Master Skywalker, X2 would put a stop to this plan. He was, unfortunately, forced to kill his older twin to put a stop to all of his madness, and afterward, X2 would officially join Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy. The final clones we need to mention are the clone bodies of Darth Sidious. However, this is a bit of a loophole. Palpatine was able to completely bypass almost all of the issues presented with our previous entries. He did this by not having his clones have a mind at all. On the fortress world of Biss, Sidious created a network of vessels from his own DNA. Upon his death, they acted as his contingency plan. He used the lost Sith art of essence transfer to move his spirit into his clone bodies. He had so many of them that if they broke down or were killed, he could simply transfer into a brand new one. This would have been the perfect plan, but issues arose internally. One of his own royal guards, Karnor Jax, betrayed him. Jax was being trained by Lumaya to become the new Dark Lord of the Sith. So when he learned that Palpatine had survived his defeat on Endor, Jax bribed the Emperor's physician to sabotage the clone bodies. This caused them to rapidly age and degrade under the Emperor's excessive power. This ultimately thwarted the success of his grand return, so it really is up to you whether you consider this entry successful or not. There's a possibility that Darth Sidious could have been one of the only truly perfected clones had he not been undermined, meaning that Sidious perfected both essence transfer and cloning, but was defeated nonetheless. This whole process is so tricky because it seems that the Force just wants to work against cloning on every single turn. A rebel scientist by the name of Niez Vance theorized that the Force was somehow responsible for the constant instability in all of the Force-sensitive clones. And he's not too far off in his assumption. To summarize a lot of the research of Darth Plagueis, midichlorians are a pain to work with. They are living creatures, and so they seem to have a will of their own that will actively resist being tampered with. Any attempts to force an outcome often results in the death of the subject. It took Darth Plagueis decades of concentrated Sith science to come anywhere close to mastering them. And even then, his focus was purely on refreshing his youth and vitality rather than perfect recreation. But he did note that in many of his experiments, coercing midichlorians to replicate themselves had disastrous results. And if we had to theorize why, it would come down to the wills. This is getting into some very deep lore here, but according to George Lucas, the wills are beings that essentially reflect the consciousness of the Force. They are microscopic entities that exist within the midichlorians. They are more powerful and more wise than any being in the universe. What many in-lore scientists may not understand is that it's not the midichlorians who are resisting them, it's the wills within them. But that of course opens up questions as to why Plagueis was able to dominate them, and how some cloning experiments were even successful. The wills are not all powerful, but they do determine a lot about how the Force and destiny operates. But that's just one of our own explanations that we could think of. So my friends, we're eager to get your thoughts on this and see why you think this process seems so insurmountable, and why, even when it's somewhat successful, still results in aberrant horrors. As always, thank you so much for watching and joining us in the archives here today, and until next time, may the Force be with you. In our exploration of Sith war beasts and Sith spawn, there exists one creature that is so bizarre and so disproportionate to its era that it almost feels like a relic that has been displaced in time. The Kakeye dragon stands apart not only for its monstrous scale, but for the strange historical shadow that it occupies. When we think of Sith spawn, the mind typically drifts towards the ancient terrors of the Dark Jedi exiles, the era of Ajunta Pao, Sorza's sin, and the earliest Sith alchemists who first fused cruelty with creation. This was the age of experimentation without restraint, where beasts of nightmare like the Terminus and warworms entered the Sith's arsenal. But the Kakeye dragon does not belong to this primordial lineage. It emerges later in the timeline, from the fractured violence of the New Sith Wars. The New Sith Wars was a time when Sith knowledge was no longer unified, but was scavenged, misinterpreted, and rebuilt from the ruins of fallen dead empires. By this point, the great Sith dynasties were long gone. The structured philosophies of Ragnos, Sadao, and Vitiate had all collapsed into something far less stable. And yet, despite that decline, something extraordinary was created in this era. The Kakeye dragon is not an alchemical guardian or temple monstrosity in the typical sense of the Terminus or the warworms, but it was a siege breaker, a living engine of destruction designed to repel armies, to devastate invasion forces, and to endure conflict that would kill powerful force wielders. The creature was vast, subterranean, and nearly impossible to detect. The creature became legend long after its master vanished into obscurity. In today's holocron, we will examine why the dragon stands apart from nearly every other Sith spawn in the archives, its scale, and its terrifying purpose. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the creature, the very real possibility that somewhere beneath the Forgotten World, the Kakeye dragon still draws breath. But before we turn our attention to the beast, we must first understand its creator, the Sith Lord Darth Revan. The resemblance to the name Darth Revan is not a coincidence or lineage, but it is a misinterpretation. Darth Revan, obsessed with excavating Sith manuscripts, spent years decoding fragmented texts that had been fought over, stolen, and preserved with bloodshed. Within those damaged records, he encountered references to a Revan, though translation errors twisted the meaning. From these flawed passages, Revan drew a conclusion that would define his identity. Believing Revan to be the true name rather than a corruption, he adopted it as his Sith title, convinced he was stepping into the legacy of a figure who had reshaped galactic history. This was proof that he stood in the shadows of greatness and was destined to extend it. Yet unlike Revan, whose philosophy wrestled constantly with balance, Darth Revan's path drifted towards something far less stable: paranoia. Where others sought power, Darth Revan only sought to isolate himself, and to protect himself from rivals, the inevitability of decay that haunted every single Sith order. His fascination lay in pushing the dark side beyond restraint, stripping away philosophy in favor of raw domination and control. This obsession drew him to Almas, a world that was hostile, toxic, and saturated with an energy that mirrored its own descent. Darth Revan was a Zolocian, a species known for a natural sensitivity to the Force. Yet that same gift carried a volatility, one rarely seen elsewhere in the galaxy. Zolocians experienced emotions with heightened intensity, feeling fear, anger, and jealousy, not as fleeting impulses, but as overwhelming states of being. For Darth Revan, this was not merely a temperament, it was the lens through which he interpreted the dark side. And on Almas, one emotion rose above the others: fear. Almas was not an ordinary refuge world. The planet was steeped in a hostile atmosphere and permeated with a strange, oppressive presence aligned with the dark side. It was something sentient, ancient within the world, not fully understood, yet undeniably influential. But Darth Revan did not recoil, he embraced it. The planet's malignant energy felt less like a threat and more like a confirmation to him, as if the world validated his growing obsession with power and survival. But it was from fear of losing that power that his fortress took form. A towering citadel rose from the wasteland, engineered as a defensive structure and a conduit. The tower itself was a weapon, capable of channeling the dark side, saturating Almas, and projecting it outward with devastating force. It was architecture fused with the Sith philosophy of domination, stone and metal shaped into an extension of Darth Revan's will. The citadel was one thing, but Darth Revan was more ambitious. Inspired by the old monsters of war, the ancient Sith histories, he sought to create a guardian figure unlike anything the Sith had ever seen. While other Sith Lords waged chaotic campaigns across the new Sith Wars, fracturing territories, Darth Revan withdrew deeper into experimentation, deeper into Almas. He removed himself from politics and he got to work. And here, he created his legacy. What emerged from these dark experiments was the Kakeye Dragon. Most dark-side creations, no matter how grotesque or lethal, are not truly force wielders. They are mutations, biological weapons shaped from alchemy, saturated with dark side energies, sometimes designed for horrifying purposes such as trapping Jedi souls, amplifying terror. They could radiate the dark side, they could be empowered by the dark side. But genuine interaction with the Force remained beyond Sith warbeasts. But the Kakeye Dragon shattered that boundary. The Kakeye Dragon was not enhanced by the dark side. It was Force-sensitive in its truest sense. The creature could unleash Force lightning with terrifying ease, projecting raw destructive energy as naturally as it breathed. Its awareness extended beyond ordinary predatory instincts, sharpened by precognitive perception, heightened reflexes, and an uncanny ability to sense disturbances in the environment. Yet the most unsettling trait of the dragon by far, like the most elusive Sith in history such as Sidious, the dragon possessed the rare ability to suppress its presence in the Force itself. When it willed it, the Kakeye Dragon vanished in the Force. To Jedi perception, to Force-based detection, it became a void. An absence where a colossal predator should have burned like a beacon of fire. An apex predator that could not be sensed. A weapon that could hide in the Force. Almas itself was an extension of the dragon's design. Beneath the scarred surface stretched a labyrinth of caverns and subterranean rivers, a vast hidden network that allowed the Kakeye Dragon to move with terrifying ease. It didn't stalk prey on the open ground, it simply appeared, one moment absence, the next moment catastrophic, erupting from darkness. Darth Revan remained entrenched within his fortress, confident in the union of world, weapon, and beast. Small Jedi strike teams occasionally ventured to the world, drawn by rumors and the unmistakable stink of the dark side. None proved capable of breaching the defenses. The dragon's sudden assaults, coupled with its unnatural abilities, turned each incursion into a massacre. But then came the day that changed everything. A Republic fleet tore from hyperspace above Darth Revan's citadel. This was not a probing force, but it was a full expedition, an overwhelming show of military power. Warships darkened the sky. Their arrival was abrupt and surgical. Against such a force, even Darth Revan's carefully tuned power and its capacity to unleash lightning into orbit no longer guaranteed his survival. But Darth Revan believed he possessed something greater than even the dragon, an artifact steeped in legend and dread. The Dark Staff. Unlike conventional Sith weaponry, the Dark Staff occupied a far more ambitious and unsettling category. Those who encountered it spoke not merely of its destructive power, but its presence and its will. Many believed the artifact possessed a form of sentience itself, aligned with the dark side, and not subordinate to any master. It was described less as a tool and more as an entity bound into shape, something that existed beyond ordinary constraints, whispering promises of domination, unconcerned with the ambitions of the Sith who wielded it. And as the Republic fleet filled the skies of Almas, Darth Revan turned to that power. As the Jedi converged, the scale of the assault left little room for illusion. Republic warships scarred the sky, fire rained from orbit. Deep within the Citadel, tremors rippled through stone and metal as sections of Darth Revan's fortress groaned under bombardment. The tower still stood. The defenses functioned. Somewhere beneath the surface, the Kakeye Dragon surged through its subterranean domain, racing towards the unfolding battle. But fear moves faster than any beast. Darth Revan felt it closing in. Not the Jedi or the fleet, but the suffocating certainty that control was slipping away. The fortress had been engineered for endurance, the dragon crafted for annihilation. Yet in that moment, neither construction nor creation could quiet the rising storm within his mind. And so he turned to the Dark Staff. The artifact responded instantly, though not as the Sith Lord had intended. Power didn't surge outward, but it collapsed in. The artifact fed, stripping the Sith Lord of the power that he sought to wield. Reality fractured around him, space twisted, and in an instant of violence and silence, Darth Revan was torn from Almas and hurled across time and conflict to the world of Ruusan, into the heart of a war already raging. Gone was the sanctuary of his fortress. Gone was the certainty of preparation. Ruusan had no throne, had no carefully calculated defenses. It offered only mud, chaos, and the brutal immediacy of battle. Drained, disoriented, Darth Revan struggled to orient himself as the din of war crashed around him. Through the haze, he sensed a presence approaching. A Jedi, not a legendary master, not a figure of myth, but a young, hardened soldier, unremarkable by every standard the Sith once used to measure power. And yet, in his weakened state, the distinction no longer mattered. Knee-deep in mud, the Sith reached for his weapon. Too slow. The distance closed in a heartbeat. Blade met with flesh. The encounter ended with brutal efficiency. The Sith reduced to little more than a casualty swallowed by the vast violence of Ruusan. There was no ceremony that marked this passing. His body left countless among the others. It became indistinguishable from the wreckage of war. After this, history on the dragon grows strangely quiet. The dragon is not recorded as slain, it simply recedes into the shadows of the timeline, as if the galaxy itself closed the chapter. There is nothing to suggest in the lore that the creature ever died. With its master gone, the Kakeye dragon becomes something more unsettling. It is an echo, a predator from an ancient war, a Force-sensitive leviathan wandering the depths of a broken planet. What Darth Revan achieved through its creation remains extraordinary. This was long before Plagueis would obsess over the manipulation of life, long before he experimented with midichlorians and the architecture of existence. But Darth Revan had already stepped into similarly forbidden territory. Through brutal Force alchemy, through the violence of biology, the dark side imposed into the flesh, he created a beast, and he altered the relationship between life and the Force. The dragon was integrated, engineered to wield the dark side as an extension of its own nature, as natural to it as breath or hunger. And then there is the most interesting parallel of all. In later ages, Sidious would become infamous for his ability to stand within the Force and remain unseen. A phantom presence, a shadow, the ability to exist where the Jedi would stand and not perceive him. But centuries earlier, Darth Revan's creation possessed the same ability, a Sith spawn capable of masking its signature, a monster the Jedi could not feel. Taken together, these elements are deeply uncomfortable. Darth Revan, a paranoid and a fearful Sith Lord experimenting in isolation, pushing alchemy beyond traditional mutation into something closer to Force-engineered life. And somewhere deep in the caverns of Almas, that creation still stirs and draws breath. Had Darth Revan chosen to stand and fight on Almas, the outcome remains one of those great unknowns of Star Wars history. Victory was never guaranteed, but survival certainly was not impossible. Entrenched in his own fortress, the Kakeye dragon unleashed on the battlefield. The cost of the conflict would have been staggering. Thousands of Republic soldiers perhaps, even hundreds or thousands of Jedi lives. The dragon alone would have transformed the battlefield. But history rarely bends around what could have been. Darth Revan wasn't undone by his own weakness, but by something more familiar to him, by fear, the emotion that he studied, the emotion that empowered him, and in the end, the emotion that destroyed him. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning, what fascinates us the most about this creature is where exactly it appears in galactic history. The new Sith Wars are not typically an era we associate with monstrous Sith war beasts, yet here we find one of the most extraordinary specimens. So for a big question for this holocron, do you believe that Darth Revan would have won on Almas had he chose to stand and fight against the Jedi and the Republic? And what would have happened with the Kakeye dragon? As always, my friends, thank you so much for visiting the channel and the archives here today, and as always, may the Force be with you.